Amidst the echoing footsteps of forgotten armies and the fading prayers of vanished empires, a frontier tribe stood at the edge of history, unnoticed, underestimated, and surrounded by giants. In the late 13th century, as the medieval world fractured under the weight of collapsing powers, no chronicler could have predicted that this modest Anatolian beylik would rise to command 3 continents and shape the destiny of Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa for more than 6 centuries. Beneath banners stitched from survival and ambition, the Ottomans did not merely conquer land, they absorbed civilizations. They ruled Christians, Muslims, and Jews under a single imperial framework. They bridged East and West not as intermediaries, but as masters. From the fall of Constantinople to the gates of Vienna, from desert caravans to Mediterranean fleets, their empire became an artery through which global history flowed. Yet power, once gained, demands balance. Innovation must outpace tradition. Authority must adapt or decay. The Ottoman story is not simply one of rise and fall. It is a study in governance, identity, faith, military evolution, and the brutal arithmetic of empire. It is a human story of visionaries and tyrants, reformers and conservatives, glory and gradual erosion. This is the complete, uninterrupted journey of the Ottoman Empire, from obscurity to dominance, and from dominance to dissolution. In the dawn of an age defined by collapse rather than creation, Anatolia stood exposed, its ancient certainties broken, its authority splintered, its future unwritten. Once the heartland of orderly rule and imperial continuity, this rugged peninsula had become a land of drifting borders and uncertain loyalties. The great roads that had carried merchants, scholars, and armies for centuries now echoed with displacement. Villages fortified themselves not against foreign conquest alone, but against the absence of protection. Power no longer flowed from capitals. It leaked into the hands of those strong enough to seize it and clever enough to keep it. The decline of the Seljuk Sultanate marked the beginning of this unraveling. Once the dominant Muslim authority in Anatolia, the Seljuks had governed through a delicate balance of military command, Persianate administration, and Islamic legitimacy. That balance shattered in the mid-13th century when the thunder of steppe warfare rolled westward. The Mongol invasions did not merely defeat armies, they hollowed out states. Cities that had once thrived as centers of learning and trade were forced into submission, their rulers reduced to tributaries, their treasuries drained, their legitimacy exposed as fragile. Anatolia became a frontier not between empires, but between order and survival. Seljuk authority lingered in name, but its command was fractured, filtered through Mongol overlords who ruled from afar. Governance turned reactive. Law became negotiable. Loyalty became transactional. In this vacuum, new political units emerged, small, aggressive, and fiercely independent. They were known as beyliks, frontier principalities carved out by war leaders who owed allegiance to no crown and legitimacy only to success. These beyliks did not resemble the grand states of earlier centuries. They were lean, mobile, and deeply local. Their leaders lived among their warriors, shared their hardships, and rose or fell with their fortunes. Lineage mattered less than courage. Survival depended not on inherited bureaucracy, but on the ability to attract followers, fighters, families, mystics, and craftsmen who sought stability in a collapsing world. Authority was personal, immediate, and constantly tested. To the west, another ancient power struggled to hold the line. The Byzantine Empire, itself weakened by centuries of internal strife and external pressure, clung to its Anatolian territories with diminishing strength. Fortresses were understaffed, garrisons went unpaid. Border towns negotiated their own arrangements with whoever could provide protection. The once clear boundary between Christian Byzantium and Muslim Anatolia dissolved into a blurred frontier of skirmishes, truces, marriages, and shared marketplaces. This borderland was not a wasteland. It was a living corridor of exchange. Languages mixed, traditions overlapped. Warriors fought by day and traded by night. Sufi mystics wandered freely, preaching faith not through coercion, but through presence and example. The rigid lines of imperial ideology softened here, replaced by pragmatic coexistence. Religion remained central, but it was no longer a barrier. It was a banner under which diverse peoples could gather, so long as leadership offered security and opportunity. Violence was constant, but it was not chaotic. It followed patterns shaped by terrain and necessity. Raids targeted supply routes, not cities. Fortresses mattered more than capitals. Horses, not thrones, determined mobility and reach. In this environment, traditional aristocracies withered. What thrived instead were men who could adapt, who understood when to fight, when to negotiate, and when to absorb rather than destroy. Warfare rewarded restraint as much as ferocity. From this crucible emerged a new political logic. The beyliks were not designed to last, yet some did. Their endurance depended on an unusual combination of openness and discipline. They welcomed converts, employed Christians, protected merchants, and distributed land based on service rather than birth. These were not ideals born of tolerance alone, but of necessity. A ruler who alienated his population did not survive long in a frontier world where allegiance could shift overnight. The land itself reinforced this transformation. Anatolia's valleys and highlands encouraged decentralization. No single power could dominate without securing dozens of local strongholds. Control was incremental, built village by village, road by road. Expansion was slow, but consolidation was deep. Those who learned to govern diversity rather than suppress it gained a decisive advantage. This was the twilight of Anatolia, not an age of decline alone, but of reformation through hardship. Empires receded, but ambition remained. The collapse of old orders did not erase the human desire for meaning, protection, and belonging. Instead, it redirected it. Out of uncertainty, new loyalties formed. Out of fragmentation, new structures began to coalesce. And somewhere within this fractured landscape, on the edge of Byzantine territory and the margins of recorded history, a minor frontier community was quietly learning how to survive and how to grow. Beneath the shadow of collapsing empires, the Anatolian frontier did not sleep. It adapted. As Seljuk authority faded into ceremonial irrelevance and Mongol oversight remained distant and extractive, daily life reorganized itself around immediacy. Protection mattered more than proclamations. Justice was measured not in law books, but in outcomes. Those who could secure roads, defend harvests, and arbitrate disputes earned loyalty faster than any distant sultan. The beyliks multiplied across this vacuum. Karamanids, Germianids, Idanids, Kandarids, each carved influence from terrain and timing, yet none possessed inherent superiority. What distinguished one from another was not size but orientation. Some remained inward-looking, bound by tribal rivalries and rigid hierarchies. Others turned outward, facing the frontier with a different vision, one that understood expansion as absorption rather than annihilation. Along the Byzantine border, this difference became decisive. The frontier was porous. Raids crossed religious lines with ease, but so did alliances. Local Christian populations, long neglected by Constantinople, often preferred the predictable taxation and relative autonomy offered by Muslim frontier lords over the instability of imperial neglect. Conversion was gradual, rarely forced. Faith spread through proximity, patronage, and shared survival, not decrees. At the heart of this transformation was a warrior culture shaped by necessity. Frontier fighters, known as Ghazis, were not professional soldiers in the classical sense. They were settlers, herdsmen, and craftsmen who took up arms when required. Their motivation blended religious idealism with material reality. Victory promised land, security, and honor. Defeat meant disappearance. There was no safety net beyond cohesion. Leadership in this world was brutally meritocratic. A commander who failed lost followers instantly. Loyalty was personal, conditional, and constantly renegotiated. Councils formed around campfires rather than palaces. Decisions were immediate. The distance between ruler and ruled was measured in steps, not protocol. This proximity fostered a political intimacy unknown in older imperial systems. Yet this intimacy came with discipline. Frontier leaders enforced order swiftly. Theft, betrayal, and cowardice were punished without ceremony. Stability was fragile, and weakness invited annihilation. The result was a society that valued loyalty over lineage, competence over title. Bloodlines mattered only if they produced capable heirs. Religion, too, evolved under frontier conditions. Islam on the Anatolian borderlands was neither rigid nor uniform. Sufi brotherhoods played a central role, offering spiritual structure in an unstable world. Their lodges became centers of hospitality, mediation, and recruitment. Mystics spoke inaccessible language, emphasizing justice, humility, and divine purpose rather than legal formalism. This spiritual flexibility complemented political pragmatism, allowing diverse populations to coexist under a shared moral framework. The Byzantine response to this pressure was uneven. Imperial resources were stretched thin, divided between Balkan conflicts, dynastic disputes, and economic decline. Border defenses relied increasingly on local arrangements rather than centralized strategy. Fortresses negotiated their own survival. Some paid tribute, others opened gates. Imperial authority became abstract, invoked, but rarely enforced. This erosion did not occur overnight. It was incremental, almost invisible. A village changed hands without ceremony. A road fell under new control. A fortress commander accepted new terms. Over decades, the map shifted not through decisive conquest, but through accumulation. Frontier beyliks learned patience. They understood that permanence came not from spectacle, but from continuity. Among these border principalities were smaller groups whose names barely appeared in contemporary records. Their leaders did not claim grandeur. They ruled modest territories, often overshadowed by stronger neighbors. Yet their position, pressed between Byzantium to the west and rival beyliks to the east, forced constant adaptation. Survival required diplomacy as much as force. Expansion demanded restraint as much as ambition. In these communities, governance began to crystallize. Land was distributed in return for service. Taxation was standardized enough to sustain armies without provoking revolt. Christian peasants retained their land and faith so long as they accepted new overlords. This inclusivity was not ideological. It was strategic. A depopulated territory produced nothing. Stability required continuity. What emerged was a prototype of empire, though no one recognized it as such. There were no declarations of destiny, no claims of universal rule. There was only momentum. Each successful season reinforced confidence. Each absorbed village expanded capacity. Over time, small advantages compounded into resilience. The Mongol presence, paradoxically, reinforced this process. By preventing the re-emergence of a strong centralized Seljuk state, Mongol oversight ensured that no single Anatolian power could dominate prematurely. The frontier remained open, competitive, and evolutionary. Only those capable of sustained adaptation endured. Thus, the twilight of Anatolia was not merely an ending. It was a proving ground. Empires receded, but political innovation advanced. Authority fragmented, but new forms of legitimacy emerged. The land did not descend into chaos. It reorganized itself around survival. And as decades passed, one frontier community, still obscure, still small, was quietly refining a system of rule shaped by tolerance, discipline, and relentless pragmatism. Its leaders did not yet know they were building an empire. But history was already moving in their direction. From the ashes of ruin, Anatolia did not fall silent. It recalibrated. The decades that followed the Seljuk collapse were not marked by a single decisive moment, but by countless small adjustments, repeated until they hardened into structure. Villages learned new allegiances, roads acquired new guardians, markets reopened under new banners. The frontier, once a line of defense, became a living system, one that rewarded those who understood time as an ally rather than an enemy. What endured in this landscape was not the loudest power, but the most consistent. Beyliks that survived longest shared certain traits. They governed lightly but decisively. They avoided unnecessary destruction. They integrated rather than erased. Authority became something that had to be demonstrated daily. Rulers were expected to appear in public, to listen, to judge disputes, to lead from the front. Distance bred suspicion, presence bred trust. This expectation reshaped leadership itself. The old imperial model, where legitimacy descended from divine sanction or ancient lineage, had little relevance here. Frontier society demanded proof. A leader's worth was measured in security delivered, disputes resolved, harvests protected. Failure was unforgiving. Success was magnetic. Men gravitated toward commanders who kept promises, distributed spoils fairly, and punished betrayal without hesitation. Over time, this environment produced a distinctive political culture. Councils formed around trusted companions rather than noble houses. Advisors were chosen for experience, not pedigree. Decisions were swift, shaped by immediate realities. Yet beneath this flexibility ran an emerging discipline. Records were kept, taxes standardized, land assignments formalized. What had begun as improvisation slowly became administration. Religion continued to bind communities without rigid uniformity. Sufi networks expanded their influence, acting as stabilizing agents in volatile regions. Their lodges fed travelers, educated children, and mediated conflicts. They offered a shared moral language across ethnic and religious lines. Faith was present everywhere, but it did not suffocate daily governance. Instead, it legitimized restraint, justice, and mutual obligation. The frontier also cultivated a particular attitude toward conquest. Destruction was costly. Empty land produced nothing. Thus, expansion favored preservation. Cities were taken intact. Local elites were co-opted. Existing laws were often retained. This approach contrasted sharply with the sack-and-burn warfare common in earlier centuries. It reflected a new understanding. Longevity mattered more than spectacle. By the end of the 13th century, Anatolia had become a mosaic of these evolving systems. No single power yet dominated. Yet the direction of change was clear. Authority was moving away from static, ceremonial rule toward adaptive governance rooted in proximity and participation. The frontier had become a school, one that taught hard lessons quickly and rewarded those who learned them. The Byzantine presence continued to fade in this environment. Imperial rhetoric could not compete with practical protection. Garrisons dwindled. Appeals to Constantinople went unanswered. Local Christian populations adjusted accordingly. Loyalty followed security. Conversion, where it occurred, was gradual and social rather than coercive. Identity shifted quietly, shaped by daily interactions rather than declarations. What emerged from this prolonged twilight was not anarchy, but selection. The frontier filtered out rigid systems and elevated flexible ones. It punished leaders who clung to outdated hierarchies and rewarded those who blended firmness with accommodation. Over generations, this process narrowed the field. Many beyliks vanished as quickly as they appeared. Others stagnated, locked into internal rivalries. A few, however, displayed unusual cohesion. They managed succession smoothly. They balanced military expansion with internal stability. They cultivated loyalty across religious lines. These were not accidents. They were the result of sustained adaptation to frontier conditions, conditions that demanded both strength and restraint. This period left no grand monuments, no imperial proclamations, no definitive borders. Its legacy was subtler but more profound. It forged a political mindset capable of scaling. It created institutions that could expand without collapsing. It normalized diversity as a strength rather than a threat. In doing so, it prepared the ground for something larger than any Beylik yet imagined. By the time the century turned, Anatolia was no longer waiting for order. It was generating it. The chaos that had followed imperial collapse had not destroyed the region's capacity for governance. It had refined it. Out of uncertainty emerged systems hardened by necessity and tempered by pragmatism. History often remembers empires by their capitals and conquests, but empires are born earlier, in borderlands, in forgotten valleys, in years without names. The Twilight of Anatolia was such a moment. It did not announce itself. It did not seek recognition. Yet it shaped the conditions that made future dominance possible. And on the western edge of this transformed landscape, among modest settlements and unassuming leaders, one frontier household was quietly absorbing every lesson the age had to offer, learning when to strike, when to wait, and how to turn survival into permanence. Thus ended the age of fragmentation, and thus began the path toward a dynasty shaped not by inheritance, but by the unforgiving wisdom of the frontier. In the final years of the 13th century, as Anatolia continued to drift through uncertainty, history did not turn toward a palace or a throne. It turned toward a tent. Not a grand pavilion of empire, but a mobile encampment pitched along the restless frontier between Byzantine decline and Muslim expansion. Here, power did not announce itself with ceremony. It emerged quietly, through presence, persistence, and reputation. At the center of this frontier world stood Osman I, not a king, not a sultan, but a war leader among many. His name carried no ancient prestige, his lineage traced back to nomadic roots rather than imperial houses. In another age, such a man would have vanished into obscurity. But the frontier was not another age. It was a proving ground where ancestry meant little and survival meant everything. Osman operated in northwestern Anatolia, a region defined by instability and opportunity. To the west lay weakened Byzantine strongholds, isolated, underfunded, and increasingly autonomous. To the east pressed rival Turkic beyliks, each seeking land, followers, and advantage. Osman's territory was modest, his resources limited, yet his position was strategic. He stood at a crossroads of decline and migration, where displaced peoples searched for protection and purpose. What distinguished Osman was not the scale of his early victories, but their meaning. He did not raid and retreat like many frontier leaders. His campaigns were deliberate. Fortified villages were taken and held. Roads were secured. Settlements were repopulated. Each gain signaled permanence. In a world accustomed to temporary dominance, this was a radical shift. Osman did not behave like a raider, he behaved like a ruler. His following reflected this transformation. Warriors gathered first, drawn by opportunity and reputation. But they did not come alone. Families followed. Artisans arrived. Religious figures, particularly Sufi mystics, established lodges within his domain. Osman's encampments began to resemble communities rather than armies. This was no accident. Stability attracted people, and people produced strength. Osman's authority rested on personal bonds. He led from the front, shared hardship, and distributed rewards visibly and consistently. Land was granted to those who served. Loyalty was recognized publicly. Disputes were settled quickly. Justice, though simple, was predictable, and predictability in a frontier world was invaluable. Those who lived under Osman's protection knew where they stood. Religion played a central role, but it was not imposed with rigidity. Osman positioned himself as a defender of Islam, yet he governed pragmatically. Christian populations under his control were taxed but not displaced. Churches remained. Local customs endured. This approach was not born of idealism but of calculation. An intact village paid taxes. A protected population remained productive. Stability generated legitimacy. The Byzantine frontier offered further opportunity. As imperial oversight weakened, local commanders sought arrangements that ensured survival. Some resisted, others negotiated. Osman understood this nuance. He exploited divisions rather than forcing uniform submission. When force was used, it was targeted. When accommodation sufficed, it was embraced. Over time, Byzantine authority eroded not through catastrophic defeat, but through quiet replacement. What emerged alongside military expansion was something more subtle: routine. Taxes were collected regularly. Land assignments were recorded. Responsibilities were defined. These were the earliest administrative habits of a future state, formed not by decree, but by repetition. Osman did not announce laws, he practiced them. Governance became habit before it became institution. Perhaps most critically, Osman ensured continuity. Unlike many frontier leaders whose power dissolved upon death, he prepared for succession. Authority was transferred within his household. Loyalty extended not only to the man, but to his line. This shift from personal leadership to dynastic continuity marked a decisive break with the volatility of frontier politics. Osman's greatest achievement was not territorial expansion. His domain remained small by imperial standards. His true success lay in redefining what a frontier principality could be. He transformed a temporary coalition into a lasting political organism. He demonstrated that power could be inherited without fragmenting, that expansion could coexist with restraint, and that legitimacy could grow from consistent rule rather than grand claims. In an age still shaped by collapse, Osman offered something rare: predictability. People aligned themselves not with an empire, but with a promise that protection would endure beyond a single season, a single raid, a single life. And as his following grew, as routines hardened into norms, and as borders slowly stabilized, the frontier began to change character. What had once been a zone of improvisation started to resemble the outline of a state. But this transformation was only beginning. Osman's dream had taken shape, but its survival would be tested by succession, rivalry, and the relentless demands of expansion. As the years passed, the frontier around Osman began to harden, not into rigid borders but into zones of expectation. People knew where his authority reached. They knew which roads were safe, which markets were protected, and which disputes would be judged fairly. In a landscape accustomed to flux, this consistency altered behavior. Farmers invested in their land. Traders extended their routes. Families settled rather than drifted. Power, once transient, acquired weight. Osman's campaigns reflected this shift. His targets were chosen not for spectacle, but for position. Fortresses that controlled valleys, passes, and trade corridors mattered more than symbolic prizes. Each capture tightened a network rather than stretching it thin. The frontier moved incrementally westward, pressing into regions long neglected by the Byzantine administration. Garrisons there were isolated, reliant on local arrangements rather than imperial reinforcement. Osman understood this fragility and exploited it patiently. Conflict along the border followed a rhythm shaped by seasons and resources. Campaigns were short, decisive, and limited in scope. There were no grand marches, no overextended sieges. Instead, pressure accumulated through repetition. A village changed allegiance. A fortress paid tribute. A road shifted control. Over time, these small changes altered the balance irreversibly. What made this expansion durable was not force alone, but governance. Osman did not uproot existing social structures where they functioned. Christian peasants remained on their land. Local leaders were retained and loyal. Taxes were predictable rather than punitive. This approach contrasted sharply with the uncertainty of Byzantine neglect and the harsher demands of some rival beyliks. For many communities, submission was not experienced as conquest, but as transition. Within Osman's growing domain, social cohesion deepened. His followers began to see themselves not merely as companions of a leader, but as members of a collective with a shared future. Marriage alliances tied families together. Land grants bound warriors to territory rather than movement. The frontier ethos shifted from raiding to stewardship. Defense mattered as much as attack. Religion continued to provide moral framing, but it did not dictate daily administration. Islamic identity offered unity among diverse Turkic groups, while Sufi figures softened its expression among non-Muslim populations. These mystics did not command armies, yet their influence was profound. Their lodges became meeting points. Their teachings reinforced obedience without coercion. Osman's association with them enhanced his legitimacy as a just and divinely favored leader, without requiring theological rigidity. The Byzantine response to this slow encroachment was uneven and increasingly symbolic. Appeals were made to Constantinople, but resources were scarce. Imperial politics were consumed by internal disputes and Balkan threats. Local commanders improvised, striking truces or withdrawing altogether. In some cases, Byzantine soldiers entered Osman's service, bringing with them knowledge of fortifications and terrain. The frontier was not a line, it was a membrane, absorbing skills as well as land. Rival beyliks watched these developments closely. Some attempted imitation, others reacted with hostility. Skirmishes flared not only with Byzantines, but with neighboring Turkic powers competing for the same pool of followers and resources. Osman navigated these pressures cautiously. He avoided overextension and chose conflict selectively. Survival remained the priority. Prestige followed naturally. Crucially, Osman began to institutionalize loyalty beyond his person. Trusted companions were given authority over districts. Responsibilities were delegated. Decisions, while still centralized, were no longer solitary. This distribution of power reduced dependence on a single figure and prepared the community for continuity. The frontier had taught a hard lesson. Leaders die, but systems endure. By the end of Osman's life, his domain remained modest compared to established states. Yet its internal cohesion set it apart. Where others fractured upon succession or stagnated through rigidity, Osman's polity displayed resilience. It had absorbed diversity without dissolving. It had expanded without exhausting itself. It had transformed followers into subjects without stripping them of agency. This was the quiet revolution of Osman's frontier dream. He did not declare a state. He did not claim imperial destiny. He allowed permanence to emerge organically, shaped by practice rather than proclamation. In doing so, he laid foundations stronger than stone. When Osman died around 1324, there was no collapse. Authority passed smoothly to his son. The banner did not fall. The roads remained open. The frontier continued to advance. This continuity marked a decisive break with the age that preceded him. The Twilight of Anatolia had produced many war leaders, but only one had turned survival into inheritance. And as the new leader took command, the experiment entered a new phase, one that would test whether a frontier dream could survive beyond its founder. When Osman's life drew to a close, the frontier did not fracture. There was no scramble among rival commanders, no sudden unraveling of loyalties, no return to the chaos that had defined so many border principalities before him. Instead, something rare occurred in medieval Anatolia: continuity. Power passed smoothly to his son, Orhan. This moment, quiet, almost administrative, marked Osman's most enduring victory. In a political landscape where authority was usually buried with the leader, the survival of his system signaled that his experiment had succeeded. What he left behind was no longer a personal following. It was a living structure. Osman had understood a truth few frontier leaders grasped. Survival was temporary, but institutions could outlive men. His final years were spent reinforcing habits rather than chasing glory. Land assignments were clarified. Trusted lieutenants were entrenched in their roles. Justice remained visible and consistent. The expectation of rule, what subjects could demand and what rulers must provide, had become normalized. This normalization changed the psychology of power. Loyalty was no longer tied solely to charisma. It was anchored to predictability. Farmers expected protection in exchange for taxes. Warriors expected land for service. Merchants expected safe passage. These expectations did not vanish with Osman's death. They demanded fulfillment from his successor. In this way, governance itself became the source of legitimacy. Osman's frontier dream had also reshaped identity. His followers no longer defined themselves simply as ghazis or raiders. They had become settlers, administrators, and defenders of a shared domain. Their sense of belonging was territorial as much as personal. The land they held was not a temporary prize, it was home. This attachment altered priorities. Defense gained prominence. Infrastructure mattered. Expansion became strategic rather than impulsive. Equally important was the way diversity had been managed. Christian communities within Osman's territory had not been erased or expelled. They had been absorbed, their churches stood, their fields were worked, their obligations were clear. Over time, some converted, others did not, but all participated in the stability of the domain. This inclusivity was not framed as tolerance in the modern sense. It was a frontier logic refined into policy. Productivity mattered more than uniformity. Osman's approach to faith reinforced this balance. He positioned himself as a champion of Islam without weaponizing belief as an instrument of coercion. Religious legitimacy enhanced authority, but it did not override pragmatism. This synthesis, faith anchored by restraint, would later allow his successors to rule vast multi-religious populations without constant rebellion. From a military perspective, Osman left behind a disciplined, experienced fighting force accustomed to both offense and defense. His men knew the terrain intimately. They understood siegecraft, negotiation, and attrition. They had learned to win not by overwhelming force, but by persistence. These habits would soon prove decisive as the frontier expanded beyond its original scale. The broader Anatolian context amplified the significance of this inheritance. Rival beyliks continued to struggle with succession disputes and internal fragmentation. Some expanded rapidly only to collapse just as quickly. Others stagnated, trapped by rigid hierarchies unsuited to a changing world. Osman's polity, by contrast, displayed an unusual elasticity. It could grow without tearing itself apart. This elasticity was his true legacy. He had not conquered a kingdom, but he had solved a problem that had undone countless rulers before him: how to turn momentum into permanence. By embedding authority in routine, loyalty in land, and legitimacy in justice, he ensured that expansion would not require reinvention at every step. In historical hindsight, it is tempting to search for prophecy or grand vision in Osman's life. Contemporary sources offer none. There were no declarations of empire, no claims of destiny. What existed instead was discipline, quiet, repetitive, and unglamorous. Osman built by accumulation. Each decision reinforced the last. Each season strengthened the structure beneath him. Empires often announce themselves with thunder. This one began with consistency. By the time Osman's banner passed into new hands, the frontier had changed character. It was no longer merely a border between worlds, it was a launching ground. The system he had forged was now capable of expansion beyond its original environment. It could absorb cities, govern populations, and adapt to new challenges without losing coherence. Osman's frontier dream had outgrown him. And as his successors looked westward toward fortified towns and ancient cities, they did so not as raiders seeking plunder, but as rulers, carrying a model of governance shaped by hardship and refined by patience. From this quiet inheritance, a frontier state stepped onto the path of conquest, and the next chapter of history began to unfold. In the years following Osman's death, the Ottoman frontier did not hesitate. It advanced, but with a different rhythm than before. What had once been driven by personal loyalty and charismatic leadership now moved according to habit, expectation, and structure. The age of improvisation was giving way to an age of discipline. This transition, quiet and methodical, would determine whether the Ottomans remained a regional curiosity or became something far more enduring. The responsibility for this transformation fell to Orhan, Osman's son and successor. Unlike his father, Orhan inherited not uncertainty, but a functioning polity, small but coherent. His challenge was not survival, but scale. Frontier systems that worked for a few thousand followers could fracture under expansion. Orhan understood that conquest without administration produced only temporary dominance. To endure, power had to be routinized. The early campaigns of Orhan reflected this awareness. Expansion continued westward, but it was deliberate. Towns were targeted not for symbolic value alone, but for economic and administrative potential. Agricultural regions mattered more than open pasture. Control of markets mattered more than seasonal raids. Each acquisition was evaluated for its ability to sustain the growing state. This logic culminated in the capture of Bursa in 1326. More than a victory, Bursa represented a transformation. Unlike frontier villages or forts, Bursa was an urban center with established institutions, workshops, religious buildings, and commercial networks. By making it their first capital, the Ottomans signaled a decisive shift, from mobile frontier leadership to sedentary governance. The city was not dismantled. Its structures were repurposed. Churches remained standing, some converted, others left intact. Markets continued to function. Local elites were not purged en masse, they were incorporated. This continuity reassured the population and preserved productivity. The Ottomans did not rule Bursa as conquerors passing through, but as administrators settling in. With urban governance came the need for formal systems. Raiding, once a primary economic activity, could no longer sustain an expanding population. Permanent taxation replaced episodic plunder. Revenue became predictable, records were kept, officials were appointed. These changes altered the social contract. Subjects no longer offered loyalty in exchange for spoils, but for stability. Land distribution was formalized through grants tied to service. Warriors received land not as private property, but as conditional holdings. In return, they were obligated to provide military service and maintain order. This system bound the army to the state and discouraged fragmentation. Power flowed upward, responsibility flowed downward. The frontier ethos of loyalty was preserved but embedded within a framework that could scale. Crucially, Orhan and his advisors did not discard what already worked. They adapted it. Byzantine administrative practices, tax assessment, land registration, urban management, were studied and selectively adopted. These were blended with Islamic legal principles to create a hybrid system that was both familiar to local populations and legitimate to Muslim elites. Governance became inclusive without losing coherence. The relationship with the surrounding Christian population reflected this pragmatism. Churches retained autonomy. Religious leaders continued to manage internal affairs. Taxes were levied, but not arbitrarily. Conversion was neither forced nor discouraged. It was allowed to occur gradually, shaped by social proximity and opportunity rather than coercion. Loyalty mattered more than belief. This approach distinguished the Ottomans from many of their contemporaries. Neighboring beyliks often collapsed under succession disputes or internal rivalries. Authority fragmented among competing heirs. Orhan, by contrast, reinforced centralized leadership while normalizing succession. Power passed through the ruling household in an orderly manner. This predictability prevented the cycles of violence that plagued rival states. The psychological impact of this stability was profound. Subjects, Muslim and Christian alike, began to view Ottoman rule as permanent rather than provisional. Investment increased, migration flowed inward. The state's capacity expanded not just through conquest, but through attraction. Order became its own form of power. By the mid-14th century, the Ottomans were no longer merely a frontier principality. They were a state in the making, defined not by tribal mobility, but by institutional continuity. Their strength did not lie in overwhelming force, but in governance that absorbed difference without erasing it. The transformation was still incomplete. Challenges remained. Expansion would soon carry the Ottomans beyond Anatolia, into entirely new political and cultural landscapes. The systems forged here would be tested under greater strain. But the foundation had been laid. The tribe had learned to govern, and in doing so, it had taken its first irreversible step toward empire. As the Ottoman domain expanded beyond the rhythms of frontier life, the demands placed upon it changed fundamentally. Growth no longer depended solely on courage or cohesion. It required systems that could endure absence, death, and distance. Orhan's rule became an extended exercise in translation, turning inherited habits into institutions capable of governing towns, fields, and diverse populations without constant personal supervision. The first and most decisive shift was economic. Raiding, once the engine of frontier survival, was unreliable and destabilizing at scale. It created wealth unevenly and encouraged movement over maintenance. Orhan replaced this model with regularized taxation. Agricultural output, market activity, and trade routes were assessed and taxed systematically. Revenue arrived predictably, allowing for planning rather than improvisation. With steady income came standing responsibilities, garrisons to pay, roads to secure, judges to appoint. Administration followed revenue. Officials were selected not only for loyalty, but for competence. Some were drawn from the ranks of the frontier elite. Others were local Christians who understood the land, the people, and the existing bureaucratic practices. This inclusion was strategic. It preserved continuity and reduced resistance. Governance became legible to those being governed. Law provided the framework that held these changes together. Islamic legal principles offered moral legitimacy among Muslim subjects, while pragmatic decrees addressed issues not covered by religious law. This dual structure allowed flexibility without chaos. Judges operated within known boundaries. Rulings were consistent enough to be trusted. Justice ceased to be personal and became procedural, a crucial step in state formation. The land system reinforced this order. Military service was rewarded with land grants tied to obligation rather than ownership. Holders benefited from the produce of the land, but they did not possess it outright. Failure to serve meant forfeiture. This arrangement discouraged independent power bases and bound military elites directly to the central authority. Loyalty was institutionalized. Urban life deepened this transformation. Towns required regulation of markets, maintenance of infrastructure, and management of diverse populations. The Ottomans did not impose uniformity. They preserved existing neighborhood structures, religious leadership, and customary practices where possible. Intervention was targeted, not total. The goal was functionality, not domination. This approach produced an unexpected result: legitimacy through restraint. Communities accustomed to disruption found stability under Ottoman rule preferable to uncertainty under distant or divided authorities. Migration increased, crafts flourished, trade routes reopened. The state's reach expanded not only through conquest, but through consent shaped by predictability. Succession, long the Achilles heel of regional powers, was addressed with equal care. Orhan ensured that authority was clearly centered within the ruling household. Potential rivals were neutralized early, not always through violence, but through integration or marginalization. The principle was clear: power must pass without fragmentation. This clarity prevented the cycles of civil conflict that weakened neighboring polities. Externally, the Ottomans benefited from the disarray of their rivals. Other beyliks struggled to reconcile expansion with internal cohesion. Some expanded rapidly, only to splinter upon succession. Others stagnated, unable to adapt frontier habits to sedentary rule. The Ottoman advantage lay in timing and method. They institutionalized early, before scale overwhelmed flexibility. The Christian populations within Ottoman territory played a crucial role in this process. By retaining property and religious autonomy, they remained economically productive and socially stable. Their integration provided administrative expertise and continuity. Over time, some families converted, others did not. The state did not demand uniform belief, only loyalty and participation. This policy was neither modern tolerance nor ideological pluralism. It was governance shaped by necessity and refined by experience. Difference was managed, not erased. Diversity became a resource rather than a liability. By the late 1330s, the Ottoman polity bore little resemblance to its origins. It was no longer a tribal coalition bound by personal allegiance. It was a structured state with defined revenue, law, and authority. Its leaders could project power beyond immediate reach because the system beneath them functioned independently. Yet this transformation introduced new pressures. Administration created distance. Institutions required oversight. Expansion raised questions of scale. The systems forged in Anatolia would soon be tested beyond familiar terrain. The state had learned to govern itself. Now it would have to govern others, across water, across cultures, and across histories far older than its own. By the middle of the 14th century, the transformation was no longer subtle. What had begun as a frontier following, bound by tents, loyalty, and seasonal warfare, had hardened into a state that could outlive its rulers. This was not the result of sudden reform or ideological vision. It was the outcome of discipline repeated until it became invisible. Under Orhan, authority acquired distance without losing legitimacy. Decisions no longer required the ruler's constant presence. Officials acted in his name. Judges ruled according to recognized procedures. Taxes arrived whether the army marched or not. The state had learned how to function in absence, a defining feature of all enduring polities. This distance could have bred alienation. In many states, institutional growth created resentment, resistance, and rebellion. The Ottomans avoided this fate by refusing to erase what already existed. They governed by overlay, not replacement. Local customs remained intact where they did not threaten order. Religious communities regulated their internal affairs. Landholders retained status so long as they acknowledged the new hierarchy. This approach stabilized newly acquired territories. Conquest did not mean cultural annihilation. It meant reorientation. Authority shifted upward. Daily life continued. This continuity reduced the psychological shock of transition. People adapted not through fear, but through routine. The role of law was central to this balance. Islamic jurisprudence provided moral legitimacy and social coherence among Muslim subjects, while pragmatic regulations addressed taxation, land tenure, and public order across religious lines. This dual structure allowed the Ottomans to rule difference without forcing uniformity. Justice became something people expected rather than feared. The military, once the primary expression of Ottoman power, became one institution among many. Warriors were no longer autonomous actors pursuing personal gain. They were tied to land, obligation, and hierarchy. Service was regulated, rewards were conditional. This shift reduced the risk of internal fragmentation and ensured that expansion served the state rather than undermining it. Succession remained a critical concern, and one the Ottomans managed with deliberate clarity. Power was centralized within the ruling family. Rival claimants were neutralized early. The principle of continuity outweighed sentiment. This was not gentler governance, but it was stable governance. The frontier had taught a harsh lesson. Hesitation invited collapse. As a result, the Ottoman polity displayed an unusual resilience. Neighboring beyliks continued to fracture under internal rivalry or external pressure. Some were absorbed peacefully, others fell after brief resistance. The Ottomans did not rush these outcomes. They allowed weakness to mature before intervening. Patience became strategy. The social composition of the state reflected this measured approach. Muslims formed the ruling core, but Christians and other communities remained integral to economic and administrative life. Conversion occurred gradually, shaped by opportunity and proximity rather than force. Over time, the ruling elite diversified, not in faith alone, but in experience and skill. Governance became pragmatic rather than doctrinal. Urban centers flourished under this stability. Markets expanded, crafts organized, trade routes reopened across Anatolia. The state's strength became visible not only in its armies, but in its infrastructure. Roads were maintained, fortifications repaired, cities connected. Power was no longer episodic, it was embedded. This embedding altered how the Ottomans viewed expansion. Conquest was no longer an end in itself. It was a means of extending a system that already worked. Each new territory was assessed for its capacity to be governed sustainably. Absorption replaced annihilation. Administration followed victory almost immediately. By the time the Ottomans looked beyond Anatolia, they did so with confidence grounded in experience. They had solved problems that had undone older powers: succession, diversity, scale, and legitimacy. They had learned how to rule people who did not share their language or faith, and how to benefit from that difference. This was the true completion of the transformation from tribe to state. Not the capture of a city, not the proclamation of authority, but the normalization of governance, the point at which power ceased to rely on personality and began to rely on structure. History often celebrates conquest, but endurance is built elsewhere. It is built in offices and courts, in tax registers and land grants, in routines that persist long after founders are buried. The Ottomans understood this before they possessed an empire, and that understanding would carry them beyond Anatolia. As the 14th century advanced, a new horizon opened. Beyond rivers and mountains lay lands shaped by different histories, defended by older cities, and bound by seas rather than frontiers. The systems forged here would soon face their greatest test. For the state had learned to stand, and now it would learn to cross. In the spring of 1453, the fate of an entire era narrowed to a single city. For more than 1,000 years, Constantinople had stood as an idea as much as a place, an impregnable threshold between worlds. Its walls had turned back Persians, Arabs, Bulgars, and Rus. Its harbors controlled the arteries of Mediterranean and Black Sea trade. Its churches carried the memory of Rome long after Rome itself had fallen. To conquer Constantinople was not merely to seize a city, it was to inherit history. Yet by the mid-15th century, the city was a shadow of its former self. The Byzantine Empire, once the backbone of Eastern Christendom, had been hollowed by centuries of internal division, crusader betrayal, and relentless pressure from without. Its territory had shrunk to little more than the city itself and a handful of surrounding lands. Its population had dwindled. Its treasury was exhausted. What remained was prestige, ancient, powerful, and fragile. Beyond the walls, the balance of power had shifted decisively. The Ottoman Empire, no longer a frontier state but a consolidated regional power, now surrounded Constantinople on nearly all sides. The city sat like a stone in the current of Ottoman expansion, symbolically defiant, strategically obstructive. As long as it endured, the Ottomans' claim to universal authority in the eastern Mediterranean remained incomplete. The man who understood this most clearly was Mehmed II. Mehmed ascended the Ottoman throne young, ambitious, and acutely conscious of history. Unlike many of his predecessors, he was educated deeply in both Islamic scholarship and classical learning. He read accounts of Alexander and Caesar, studied siegecraft and engineering, and spoke multiple languages. To him, Constantinople was not merely a military objective, it was destiny. He believed the city's capture would legitimize Ottoman rule, not just politically, but cosmically. Preparation began long before the first cannon fired. Mehmed restructured the military, secured the loyalty of key commanders, and stabilized the internal politics of the empire. He understood that failure before Constantinople would invite rebellion and fracture. This could not be a gamble. It had to be decisive. He also understood the city's defenses. Constantinople's Theodosian walls, layered, massive, and battle-tested, were the strongest fortifications in the medieval world. Previous attackers had failed not for lack of courage, but for lack of technology. Mehmed intended to change that equation. Under his patronage, massive cannon were constructed, some of the largest ever seen in Europe. These weapons did not guarantee victory, but they altered the psychological balance. Stone that had resisted centuries of assault would now be tested by a new age of gunpowder. At the same time, Mehmed moved to isolate the city. Ottoman control of surrounding territories cut off land-based relief. Naval preparations aimed to neutralize Constantinople's access to the sea. The city's defenders, brave but vastly outnumbered, could not rely on reinforcements from a divided Christendom. Appeals to Western Europe produced promises, not armies. Inside Constantinople, tension thickened the air. The population understood the stakes. This was not another siege to be endured and outlasted. This was an existential confrontation. Religious processions filled the streets. Ancient icons were carried along the walls. The city placed its faith in stone, prayer, and memory. Outside the walls, the Ottoman camp grew into a temporary city of its own. Soldiers from across the empire assembled. Anatolians, Balkan converts, veterans of earlier campaigns. They did not see themselves as raiders or mercenaries. They saw themselves as participants in history. When the siege began in April 1453, it was relentless. Artillery battered the walls day after day. Assaults were launched, repelled, and launched again. The defenders fought with desperation, improvising repairs each night. The city did not fall quickly. It resisted with the full weight of its past. But time favored the besiegers. Mehmed adjusted tactics continuously. When naval access proved resilient, he ordered ships dragged overland into the Golden Horn, an act of logistical audacity that shattered Byzantine morale. Each innovation narrowed the defenders' margin for survival. The siege was not just physical, it was psychological. The sense of inevitability crept inward. Constantinople was not yet conquered, but its isolation was complete. And as the walls trembled under cannon fire, the medieval world stood unknowingly at the edge of an ending. For when the city fell, it would not be merely an empire that collapsed, but an age. As April turned to May, the siege settled into a grim rhythm: thunder, dust, repair, and prayer. Each dawn revealed new scars carved into the ancient stone of Constantinople's walls. Each night, defenders labored in exhaustion, filling breaches with timber, earth, and whatever rubble could be found. The city was no longer defended by its strength alone, but by human will stretched to its limit. Mehmed's artillery never rested. The great bombards were slow to reload, prone to overheating, and dangerous even to their crews, but their presence changed the nature of warfare. Walls that had once symbolized permanence now cracked under repeated impact. The sound echoed across the city, a low, concussive roar that carried fear as effectively as destruction. Stone dust filled the air, roofs trembled. The psychological toll was relentless. Inside the city, leadership rested with Emperor Constantine VII, a man acutely aware that history had narrowed to his decisions. Resources were scarce. Manpower was limited to a small force of Byzantine soldiers and foreign volunteers, most notably Genoese fighters led by Giovanni Giustiniani. These men defended multiple sections of wall simultaneously, running from breach to breach as the situation demanded. There were no reserves. Every injury weakened the line permanently. Religion infused every action. Churches remained open day and night. Clergy led processions along the walls, chanting prayers beneath the sound of cannon fire. The city's defenders believed that they were standing not only for territory, but for the survival of a sacred inheritance. Constantinople had endured before. Many believed it would endure again. Outside the walls, Mehmed observed, adjusted and waited. He did not rush the final assault. Time worked in his favor. Supplies flowed steadily into the Ottoman camp. Morale remained high, fueled by the sense that they were participating in a moment larger than themselves. This was not a campaign for plunder. It was an act of transformation. The Ottomans attacked repeatedly, probing weaknesses. Some assaults were repelled with heavy losses. Others achieved temporary footholds. Each clash refined Ottoman tactics and exhausted the defenders further. The walls were no longer a continuous barrier, but a patchwork of damage and repair. One maneuver, however, altered the siege irrevocably. Constantinople's greatest advantage lay in its access to the Golden Horn, protected by a massive chain stretched across its entrance. This barrier had prevented enemy fleets from entering the harbor for centuries, ensuring that the city could be resupplied by sea even during land sieges. Mehmed understood that as long as the harbor remained secure, the city retained hope. Rather than confront the chain directly, he circumvented it. In a feat of engineering and logistics, Ottoman forces constructed a greased roadway over the hills north of the harbor. Under cover of darkness, ships were hauled overland and launched into the Golden Horn behind the chain. When dawn broke, Byzantine defenders saw Ottoman sails where none should have been. The harbor, once a sanctuary, had become a front. The impact was immediate. Defensive resources were split. Morale faltered. The city's last advantage had been neutralized, not by brute force, but by ingenuity. The siege was no longer balanced. It was tightening. In the final weeks, Mehmed intensified pressure. Continuous bombardment widened breaches. Sappers undermined walls. Naval skirmishes distracted defenders. The strategy was clear: exhaust the city, fracture its focus, and strike decisively. On the night of May 28, 1453, the city braced for the inevitable. Religious services filled Hagia Sophia and countless smaller churches. Prayers were whispered and shouted. Emperor Constantine addressed his troops, acknowledging the hopelessness of the situation while affirming their duty. There would be no retreat. There was nowhere to retreat to. Before dawn on May 29th, the final assault began. Waves of Ottoman troops advanced toward the walls. Irregular forces attacked first, absorbing defensive fire and draining energy. They were followed by more disciplined units, pressing the weakened points. Finally, elite soldiers moved forward, exploiting breaches that could no longer be sealed. Fighting devolved into chaos, hand-to-hand combat amid smoke, rubble, and screams. A critical moment came when Giustiniani was wounded and withdrew from the walls. The loss of his leadership triggered panic among defenders at a key section. The line buckled. Ottoman troops poured through a breach near the gate of St. Romanus. Within hours, resistance collapsed. Emperor Constantine VII was last seen fighting among his men. His body was never conclusively identified. With his death, the Byzantine Empire ended, not with ceremony but with silence beneath the sound of conquest. By mid-morning, Ottoman banners flew over the city. Constantinople had fallen. Yet, even in victory, Mehmed acted with restraint. He entered the city not as a destroyer, but as a ruler conscious of legacy. The sack, customary in medieval warfare, was limited. Order was restored. Key buildings were protected. Hagia Sophia was converted into a mosque, but preserved rather than destroyed. The city's transformation had begun, but its story was not over. For Constantinople was no longer the end of an empire. It was the beginning of another. When the fighting ceased, the city did not burn into oblivion. Instead, it held its breath. The conqueror entered Constantinople not as a triumphant raider intoxicated by victory, but as a ruler acutely aware of the weight now resting on his shoulders. He walked through streets scarred by siege, past abandoned homes and shattered defenses, toward monuments that had once embodied Roman and Christian universality. In that moment, conquest transformed into responsibility. This restraint was deliberate. Medieval custom allowed a victorious army days of unrestricted plunder. The new ruler curtailed it quickly. Order was restored. Soldiers were withdrawn from key districts. The city was not to be erased. It was to be reborn. What had fallen was not meant to vanish. It was meant to change hands. The most symbolic act came within the great church at the city's heart. Its conversion into a mosque was not an act of destruction, but of succession. The structure remained standing. Its mosaics were preserved beneath plaster rather than smashed. The building was claimed, not obliterated. This decision sent a clear message. The Ottomans did not intend to annihilate the past. They intended to inherit it. With that inheritance came a name and a future. Constantinople began its transformation into Istanbul, not overnight but through policy, population, and purpose. The city's emptiness posed a problem. Years of decline and siege had drained its people. A capital without inhabitants was a symbol without substance. The solution was repopulation by design. Families were relocated from across the empire, Muslims, Christians, and Jews alike. Craftsmen, merchants, scholars, and administrators were encouraged or compelled to settle. Vacant neighborhoods were assigned new life. Markets reopened. Trade resumed. The city's streets, once silent, began to hum again, not with the echoes of empire past, but with the cadence of empire forming. Administrative transformation followed physical renewal. Istanbul became the center of governance, diplomacy, and culture. The ruler did not abandon existing institutions blindly. Instead, he studied them. Roman law, Byzantine bureaucracy, Islamic jurisprudence, each offered tools. What emerged was not a replica of the past, but a synthesis. Authority was centralized. Offices were defined. Protocols standardized. Power became legible. Crucially, Christian institutions were preserved. The Orthodox Church continued to function, now reorganized under a new political reality. Its leaders were granted authority over their communities, responsible for internal affairs in exchange for loyalty. This arrangement stabilized the population and prevented mass resistance. Faith remained, but sovereignty had shifted. The psychological shock of the conquest rippled far beyond the city's walls. In Europe, the fall of Constantinople was received not merely as a military defeat, but as a civilizational rupture. The last remnant of Rome had vanished. The ancient balance between East and West had been broken. What had once been a distant frontier power was now unmistakably imperial. Trade routes felt the impact immediately. Ottoman control over key passages between the Mediterranean and Black Sea altered the flow of goods and wealth. European merchants faced new realities. Old assumptions no longer held. This disruption accelerated Western efforts to seek alternative routes to Asia, setting in motion explorations that would reshape the global order. Within the Ottoman world, The conquest recalibrated identity. The state was no longer defined by frontier struggle alone. It now possessed a universal city, one that symbolized continuity with past empires while projecting a distinctly new authority. The ruler styled himself not merely as a sultan, but as a sovereign heir to Roman imperium. Titles changed. Ambitions expanded. Yet the transformation was not solely symbolic. The city became a laboratory for imperial governance. Legal systems were tested, urban administration refined, religious pluralism institutionalized. Istanbul was not just a capital, it was a proof of concept. If the empire could govern this city, layered with centuries of identity and expectation, it could govern anything. The conquest also reshaped the Ottoman military psyche. The walls that had resisted for a millennium had fallen. Siege warfare had entered a new age. Gunpowder, engineering, logistics, and centralized command had proven decisive. The empire now possessed both the confidence and the capability to challenge the greatest powers of its time. But perhaps the most profound change was internal. The Ottomans were no longer rising. They had arrived. Their legitimacy no longer depended on survival or expansion alone. It was anchored in possession of a city that had defined empire itself. From this point forward, every campaign, reform, and decree would be measured against the standards set in 1453. History often marks moments of collapse more vividly than moments of construction. But the true significance of Constantinople's fall lay not in what ended, but in what began. An ancient empire died, but a new one stepped fully into the world. The Ottomans were no longer heirs in waiting. They were emperors, in fact. And from the domes and streets of their new capital, the empire would now turn outward, toward law, faith, and power on a continental scale. In the aftermath of conquest, the greatest challenge an empire faces is not expansion, but coherence. Territory can be taken by force, cities can be subdued by arms, but obedience, legitimacy, and continuity cannot be extracted at sword point alone. They must be cultivated. After the capture of Constantinople, the Ottomans stood at a critical threshold. They now ruled over lands stretching across cultures, languages, and faiths. The frontier habits that had once sustained growth were no longer sufficient. Empire demanded order, visible, predictable, and resilient. The Ottomans did not invent governance anew. They inherited centuries of legal tradition from the Islamic world and centuries of administrative precedent from the lands they absorbed. Their achievement lay in synthesis. Instead of choosing between religious authority and imperial command, they fused the two into a system flexible enough to rule difference without dissolving into chaos. At the heart of this system stood law. Islamic law provided moral legitimacy and social coherence among Muslim subjects. It governed matters of worship, family, inheritance, and personal conduct. It was deeply rooted, widely understood, and resistant to arbitrary manipulation. Yet it was not designed to regulate the full complexity of an empire, especially one ruling millions of non-Muslims across multiple continents. For that, the Ottomans relied on imperial decrees, state law issued in the name of the ruler. These regulations addressed taxation, land tenure, criminal punishment, military obligations, and administrative procedure. Where religious law was silent, imperial law spoke. Where religious law was inflexible, imperial law adapted. This dual structure was not a contradiction, it was a balance. Judges applied religious law within known boundaries. State officials enforced imperial regulations uniformly. The two systems overlapped but did not cancel each other out. Instead, they formed a layered legal environment where predictability mattered more than ideological purity. Subjects learned what was expected of them. Officials learned the limits of their authority. Justice became something that could be anticipated rather than feared. This predictability proved revolutionary. Across the empire, religious communities were not dissolved into a single enforced identity. Instead, they were organized as semi-autonomous collectives. Each community governed its internal affairs, marriage, education, worship, charity, according to its own traditions. Religious leaders became intermediaries between the state and their people, responsible for maintaining order and ensuring tax compliance. This arrangement achieved several objectives simultaneously. It reduced the administrative burden on the central government. It preserved social stability by minimizing disruption, and it transformed religious leaders into stakeholders in imperial continuity. Rebellion no longer threatened only the state. It threatened the authority of local elites themselves. Authority in this system flowed downward, but loyalty flowed upward. The ruler stood above these communities not as a sectarian enforcer, but as a guarantor of balance. His legitimacy did not rest solely on military victory or divine favor, but on his ability to protect difference without allowing it to fracture the state. This role, as arbiter, protector, and final authority, gave imperial power a moral dimension beyond coercion. Centralization, however, was real. Taxes were collected in the ruler's name. Military service answered to the center. Law courts operated within a defined hierarchy. Governors were appointed, rotated, and dismissed at will. Autonomy existed, but only within boundaries enforced by the state. This distinction mattered. Cultural freedom did not mean political independence. Communities could worship as they wished, but sovereignty was not shared. The empire tolerated belief, not rebellion. Inclusion was engineered, not accidental. Compared to contemporary European states, this approach was striking. Elsewhere, rulers increasingly pursued religious uniformity as a tool of control. Dissent was treated as treason. Identity was narrowed. Conflict followed. The Ottoman model moved in the opposite direction. Difference was compartmentalized, regulated, and harnessed. The result was stability. Markets functioned because merchants trusted the law. Agriculture flourished because land tenure was predictable. Cities expanded because populations felt secure. Economic productivity rose not in spite of diversity, but because diversity was managed rather than crushed. This legal architecture also shaped the imperial mindset. Power was no longer reactive. It was procedural. Decisions were recorded. Precedents accumulated. Authority became institutional rather than personal. Even the ruler was bound, if not always in practice, then in expectation, by the system he presided over. Empire, at this stage, was no longer an experiment. It was a framework. Yet frameworks invite pressure. As the empire expanded, contradictions would emerge. Flexibility would be tested. Centralization would strain autonomy. Law would collide with ambition. For now, the balance held. The Ottomans had achieved something rare in history, a system that ruled many without demanding sameness, an empire built not on uniformity, but on managed plurality. And at its center stood a ruler whose authority was no longer defined only by conquest, but by law itself. As the Ottoman realm widened, law became not merely a tool of order, but a language of governance spoken across continents. It had to be intelligible to villagers and merchants, judges and generals, Muslims and Christians alike. The genius of the Ottoman system lay in how it translated authority into everyday life, quietly, consistently, and with minimal disruption. At the apex of this system stood the Sultan, not as a distant despot, but as the final guarantor of balance. His authority was absolute in theory, yet circumscribed in practice by custom, precedent, and expectation. He issued decrees, appointed officials, and commanded armies, but his power derived its durability from restraint. The empire did not run on whim. It ran on routine. This routine depended on the interaction between two legal spheres. Religious law governed the moral and personal dimensions of Muslim life. Imperial law addressed the practical needs of rule. taxation, policing, military organization, and public order. Where these domains intersected, accommodation prevailed. Judges recognized imperial regulations. Officials respected religious courts. Conflict was managed through hierarchy rather than confrontation. The effect was clarity. Subjects understood which rules applied to which aspects of life. Officials understood the limits of their mandate. Disputes could be resolved without escalating into rebellion. In a world where lawlessness often accompanied conquest, this predictability was transformative. Nowhere was this more evident than in the organization of religious communities. Rather than dissolve existing identities, the Ottomans formalized them. Christian and Jewish populations were grouped into self-governing communities responsible for their own internal affairs. Marriage, education, worship, and charity remained under communal control. Leaders were selected from within the community, invested with authority recognized by the state. These leaders became intermediaries, buffers between imperial power and local life. They collected taxes, enforced discipline, and mediated disputes. In return, they retained status and influence. This arrangement aligned interests. Stability benefited everyone involved. Rebellion threatened not only the empire, but the local hierarchies that depended on it. Crucially, this system did not dilute central authority. Political sovereignty remained indivisible. Communities governed themselves culturally, not politically. They did not raise armies or conduct diplomacy. They did not challenge imperial law. Autonomy existed within boundaries defined and enforced by the state. This distinction allowed the Ottomans to rule vast territories with limited administrative manpower. The empire did not need to micromanage belief to control behavior. Loyalty was measured in taxes paid and order maintained, not in confessions extracted. Compliance mattered more than conversion. The economic consequences were profound. Trade flourished across religious lines. Jewish merchants moved freely between ports. Christian artisans supplied imperial projects. Muslim landholders invested in agriculture. Markets became meeting points rather than battlegrounds. The law protected contracts regardless of faith, encouraging participation from all quarters. Urban centers benefited most from this stability. Cities that had suffered from cycles of conquest and neglect now experienced continuity. Infrastructure was maintained, courts functioned, guilds organized production. The state's presence was visible but not oppressive. It intervened when necessary and withdrew when possible. This balance also shaped imperial identity. The Ottomans did not define themselves solely as a Muslim power ruling non-Muslims. They saw themselves as custodians of order in a diverse world. The ruler's role expanded beyond commander-in-chief to protector of communities. This claim was not symbolic. It was operational. When disputes arose between religious groups, the state adjudicated. When external powers attempted to intervene under the pretext of protection, the Ottomans asserted their own authority. Compared to the religious conflicts tearing through contemporary Europe, this model offered an alternative path. Uniformity was not pursued as a prerequisite for loyalty. Instead, difference was compartmentalized and regulated. Stability was engineered, not enforced through fear alone. Yet this system carried inherent tension. Centralization required oversight. Autonomy required trust. Expansion increased complexity. As the empire grew, maintaining balance would demand constant adjustment. Law would be tested by ambition. Faith would intersect with politics. Power would invite resistance. For now, however, the architecture held. The Ottomans had constructed a legal and social framework capable of sustaining empire without erasing the pasts of those it ruled. Authority flowed from the center, but life retained its local texture. This was not tolerance as ideal, it was governance as craft. And like all crafted systems, it depended on vigilance. The question that loomed was not whether this balance could be achieved, it already had been, but whether it could endure as the empire's reach expanded and the pressures of power intensified. By the height of Ottoman expansion, Law had become more than an administrative necessity. It had become the empire's spine. Armies could conquer and cities could submit, but only a shared legal rhythm could keep a vast, heterogeneous realm from tearing itself apart. The Ottomans understood this earlier than most. Their genius was not simply in creating rules, but in defining roles, especially the role of the ruler himself. The Sultan stood at the apex of this system not merely as sovereign, but as guardian. His authority was supreme, yet it was framed as responsibility rather than license. He was expected to protect the faith of Muslims, the rights of non-Muslims, the integrity of the law, and the stability of the realm. Power was personal, but legitimacy was conditional, anchored in the visible maintenance of order. This expectation shaped governance at every level. Officials did not rule in their own name. Judges did not invent law. Governors did not act independently. All authority flowed from the center, but it was constrained by precedent and accountability. Abuse of power was not rare, but it was recognized as abuse, not entitlement. That distinction mattered. The legal balance between religious law and imperial decree proved essential here. Religious courts addressed matters of conscience and community life, while imperial regulations governed public order and state interests. Neither sphere was absolute. Each checked the other through practice. This prevented both theocracy and arbitrary rule, creating space for adaptation without chaos. Faith, within this framework, became a stabilizing force rather than a source of constant conflict. The empire did not demand religious conformity, nor did it treat belief as irrelevant. Instead, it integrated faith into governance through structure. Religious leaders were empowered, but also made accountable. Communities were protected, but also obligated. The result was not equality in the modern sense, but predictability in the historical one. Predictability bred loyalty. Subjects who knew the limits of authority were less likely to resist it. Communities that retained their institutions were less likely to rebel. Merchants who trusted the courts invested their wealth locally. Farmers who trusted land tenure improved their fields. Stability became self-reinforcing. This stability extended across continents. From the Balkans to Anatolia, from the Levant to North Africa, the same legal logic applied, adapted to local conditions but recognizable in form. The empire did not rule through uniform culture, but through uniform expectation. People understood what the state would protect and what it would punish. The Sultan's role as protector of diverse faiths reinforced this understanding. When conflicts arose between communities, the state intervened not as a partisan, but as arbiter. When external powers claimed the right to defend co-religionists within Ottoman lands, the empire rejected that premise. Protection was not outsourced. Sovereignty was indivisible. This posture enhanced legitimacy abroad as well as at home. The Ottomans were not merely conquerors, they were custodians of order in a fractured world. Their capital hosted patriarchs, rabbis, scholars, and jurists under imperial oversight. Diversity did not signal weakness, it signaled control. Yet the system was never static. Law required constant adjustment. New territories introduced new customs. Economic change demanded new regulation. Military innovation altered social hierarchies. The Ottomans responded not with rigid doctrine, but with incremental reform. Decrees accumulated, precedents evolved. The system breathed. This capacity for adjustment delayed the fractures that plagued other empires. Where rigidity provoked rebellion, Ottoman flexibility absorbed pressure. Where uniformity sparked resistance, inclusion diffused it. The empire endured not because it avoided conflict, but because it managed it institutionally. Still, tension remained inherent. Centralization risked overreach. Autonomy risked fragmentation. The balance required vigilance from the center and discipline from the periphery. When either faltered, cracks appeared. Law could be bent, power could be abused, faith could be politicized. But for centuries, the framework held. The Ottomans had achieved something rare, an imperial order that ruled many without demanding sameness, that centralized power without erasing identity, and that derived legitimacy not solely from conquest, but from governance itself. Law became memory, faith became structure, power became routine. And from this equilibrium, engineered rather than assumed, the empire would draw its greatest strength. For with law to bind, faith to legitimize, and power to enforce, the Ottomans were now prepared for the next transformation, the rise of institutions that would dominate war, administration, and society itself. Beyond courts and communities, a new force was taking shape, disciplined, permanent, and loyal not to clan or creed, but to the state. In the age of empires, conquest was rarely decided by courage alone. It was decided by organization, by discipline refined into habit, by loyalty engineered rather than assumed, and by violence transformed into system. As the Ottoman state matured, its leaders understood a hard truth learned from centuries of warfare. Temporary armies win battles, but permanent armies build empires. From this understanding emerged one of the most consequential military institutions in world history, the Janissaries. They were not knights bound by feudal obligation. They were not tribal warriors loyal to clan or blood. They were something new, a salaried professional infantry whose allegiance belonged exclusively to the state, and ultimately to the Sultan himself. In a medieval world still dominated by feudal levies and personal retinues, this was revolutionary. The roots of the Janissaries lay in the Ottomans' evolving conception of power. As territory expanded across Anatolia and into the Balkans, reliance on irregular frontier fighters became a liability. Raiders were effective in chaos but unreliable in administration. They followed opportunity, not command. The state required a force that could be mobilized predictably, trained uniformly, and deployed strategically. To build such a force, the Ottomans turned inward to the structure of society itself. Through a system later known as devshirme, Christian boys were periodically recruited from imperial territories, particularly in the Balkans. Removed from their families at a young age, they were converted to Islam, educated in Ottoman language and culture, and subjected to years of rigorous training. This process was not random. Candidates were selected for physical aptitude, intelligence, and adaptability. The goal was not simply to produce soldiers, but to shape identities. These boys grew into men with no tribal base, no hereditary loyalty, and no competing claims on their allegiance. Their social world was the institution that raised them. Their future depended entirely on imperial favor. This dependency was not a weakness, it was the foundation of their discipline. Training was relentless. Physical endurance was paired with moral instruction. Obedience was drilled into reflex. Advancement depended on merit rather than birth. Those who excelled rose through the ranks. Those who failed were removed. The result was a corps bound not by kinship, but by shared formation, a collective identity engineered by the state. The Janissaries were also paid regularly. This seemingly administrative detail carried profound implications. Salaries severed the traditional link between warfare and plunder. Soldiers no longer depended on loot for survival. They depended on the treasury. In return, the state demanded absolute loyalty and continuous readiness. War became a profession rather than a seasonal activity. Equally transformative was the Janissaries' early adoption of firearms. While many European armies clung to knightly traditions and resisted gunpowder weapons as dishonorable or unreliable, the Ottomans embraced them pragmatically. Muskets, artillery, and coordinated infantry tactics became central to their battlefield doctrine. The Janissaries trained extensively with firearms, integrating them into disciplined formations capable of sustained fire. This integration altered the balance of power. Fortifications once thought impregnable fell under artillery bombardment. Cavalry charges lost effectiveness against coordinated infantry volleys. Battles increasingly favored cohesion over individual heroism. The Ottomans did not merely use new weapons, they reorganized warfare around them. The consequences were immediate and far-reaching. Ottoman armies advanced steadily into the Balkans, overpowering feudal forces ill-equipped to face disciplined infantry supported by artillery. Victories were not isolated events. They accumulated into momentum. Each conquest expanded the tax base. Each new territory funded larger armies. War and administration began to feed each other in a self-reinforcing cycle. This symbiosis between state and military marked a decisive shift. The army was no longer an extension of society. It was an institution of the state. Its needs shaped fiscal policy. Its structure influenced governance. Its success validated central authority. The Sultan's power rested not only on law and legitimacy, but on a force capable of enforcing both. The Janissaries became the visible embodiment of this new order. They marched in uniform ranks. They lived under strict codes. They answered to a chain of command that bypassed local elites entirely. Their presence projected inevitability. Resistance became costly. Rebellion became futile. Yet embedded within this success were the first hints of future tension. Privilege accumulated. Status hardened. What began as a meritocratic institution would, over time, develop interests of its own. Loyalty to the state, once absolute, would eventually compete with loyalty to the institution itself. But in this moment, at the height of their formation, the Janissaries represented the cutting edge of imperial power. They were not simply soldiers. They were an idea made flesh, that the state could manufacture loyalty, discipline, and force on a scale never before achieved. With them, the Ottomans did not just win battles. They changed how wars were fought. As the Janissary Corps matured, its influence extended far beyond the barracks. It reshaped how the Ottomans planned campaigns, governed provinces, and imagined power itself. The army was no longer a tool deployed when necessary. It was a permanent presence around which the state increasingly organized its priorities. Gunpowder accelerated this transformation. While many contemporaries experimented hesitantly with firearms, the Ottomans integrated them systematically. Artillery trains accompanied campaigns as a matter of doctrine. Musketeers drilled year-round. Logistics adapted to sustain ammunition, powder, and maintenance. Siege warfare became a science of timing and pressure rather than brute persistence. Walls fell not because defenders lost heart, but because stone could no longer withstand sustained bombardment. The Janissaries stood at the center of this new military grammar. Their formations coordinated fire and movement with a precision that feudal forces could not easily replicate. Where knights relied on shock and valor, the Janissaries relied on rhythm. Advance, halt, fire, reload, advance again. Discipline replaced spectacle. The battlefield became procedural. These methods proved devastating across the Balkans. Feudal levies, raised seasonally and loyal to local lords, struggled against an army that did not disperse after harvest or retreat when plunder failed. Ottoman forces could remain in the field longer, strike repeatedly, and consolidate gains methodically. Victories were followed by administration, not withdrawal. Expansion into southeastern Europe followed this logic. Fortresses were isolated, bombarded, and absorbed. Local elites were co-opted or displaced. Land was redistributed under state supervision. Each conquest extended the reach of taxation and recruitment, feeding the very army that had enabled it. War and statecraft became inseparable. This integration changed the relationship between ruler and military. The Sultan was no longer merely first among warriors. He became the supreme commander of an institutional force whose loyalty was structured rather than personal. Campaigns were planned centrally, Command hierarchies formalized. Promotions depended on service and performance within the system. The Janissaries' presence also altered internal politics. Their proximity to the capital and their role as guardians of the ruler gave them visibility unmatched by other institutions. They participated in ceremonies, guarded palaces, and symbolized imperial authority in daily life. Their uniforms, discipline, and numbers projected permanence. The state's power was no longer abstract. It marched through streets and stood watch at gates. Economically, the implications were immense. Salaries required reliable revenue. The treasury expanded its reach. Tax assessment became more precise. Fiscal administration professionalized. Military needs justified bureaucratic growth. Clerks, accountants, and inspectors multiplied. The empire's administrative complexity increased not as an abstract reform, but as a practical response to sustaining a standing army. This cycle reinforced itself. Better administration funded stronger armies. Stronger armies secured more territory. More territory expanded revenue. The empire entered a phase of accelerated consolidation in which military success validated centralization, and centralization enabled further success. Yet this very success began to alter the Janissaries themselves. As campaigns multiplied and victories accumulated, status hardened into privilege. Membership in the corps became desirable not only for service, but for security and influence. Over time, recruitment practices shifted, exceptions multiplied. Sons of Janissaries sought entry. Urban connections replaced rural selection. What had been engineered dependence began to soften into inherited position. The institution's relationship to firearms also evolved. Early innovation gave way to routine. Training remained rigorous, but adaptability slowed. As European armies continued to refine tactics and technology, the Janissaries increasingly relied on established methods that had once guaranteed dominance. Success bred confidence. Confidence bred conservatism. Politically, their influence deepened. As guardians of the capital and symbols of legitimacy, the Janissaries became stakeholders in succession and policy. They could make or unmake rulers by withholding support. Their loyalty, once unambiguous, became conditional. The institution that had been designed to eliminate factionalism began to exhibit it. These developments did not immediately undermine the empire. For generations, the Janissary machine continued to function effectively. Campaigns in the Middle East and North Africa extended Ottoman influence across 3 continents. Victories reinforced the belief that the system remained sound. Warnings were subtle, easily ignored amid success. But tension was accumulating beneath the surface. The very features that had made the Janissaries indispensable, permanence, privilege, proximity to power, now complicated reform. Change threatened status. Innovation challenged routine. The state, once able to shape the institution at will, increasingly had to negotiate with it. For now, the balance held. The Janissaries remained the empire's cutting edge, their discipline unmatched, their presence decisive. They were still a machine, finely tuned, formidable, and feared. Yet history had begun its quiet work. Institutions, like empires, are shaped by their origins, and the origins of the Janissary Corps, as a solution to instability, would one day collide with a world that demanded renewal. At its height, the Janissary institution appeared invincible. It had carried the Ottoman banner from the Danube to the Nile, from the walls of European fortresses to the deserts of Arabia. It had outlasted dynasties, humbled feudal armies, and transformed warfare itself. Yet the very permanence that made it powerful also made it rigid. The machine that had once been engineered to serve the state now began, slowly and subtly, to shape the state in return. This transformation did not arrive as crisis. It arrived as habit. Over generations, the Janissaries ceased to be an experiment and became a fixture. Their salaries were expected, their privileges normalized, their role in ceremonial and political life expanded. What had once been a tightly controlled instrument of central authority developed corporate identity and collective interests. Loyalty to the Sultan remained a principle, but loyalty to the institution increasingly competed with it. Recruitment reflected this shift. The early logic of severed ties and manufactured dependence eroded. Sons of Janissaries gained access. Urban connections replaced frontier selection. Entry became inheritance rather than transformation. The core grew larger but less cohesive. Discipline remained, but its edge dulled. The institution persisted, but it changed character. This evolution altered the empire's relationship with innovation. Gunpowder warfare had once given the Ottomans decisive advantage, but technological leadership is perishable. As European states reorganized their militaries, standardizing drill, improving logistics, refining artillery, the gap narrowed. Adaptation was required. Reform demanded retraining, restructuring, and sometimes reduction. Each of these threatened entrenched privilege. Resistance followed. Proposals to modernize equipment, alter command structures, or revise recruitment met obstruction. Reformers encountered not only inertia, but active opposition. The Janissaries were no longer merely soldiers. They were a political force with visibility, numbers, and influence at the heart of the capital. Their cooperation could not be assumed. It had to be negotiated. This dynamic constrained the state. The army that had once enabled centralization now complicated it. Sultans found themselves balancing authority against appeasement. Decisions were delayed, compromises multiplied. Reform advanced unevenly, often too cautiously to match the pace of external change. Yet it would be a mistake to frame this as simple decay. For centuries, the Janissary Corps continued to function as the backbone of imperial defense. Campaigns were still waged, territories were still held. The system endured far longer than most of its contemporaries. Its decline, when it came, was gradual, not catastrophic. The empire did not collapse because of the Janissaries. It struggled because the world around it accelerated. The deeper lesson lay in the relationship between institution and adaptability. The Ottomans had pioneered the standing army as an instrument of state power. In doing so, they solved the problem of feudal fragmentation. But success hardened solutions into tradition. What had once been flexible became fixed. The same discipline that produced cohesion now resisted change. The machine, designed to eliminate unpredictability, could not easily retool itself for a new age. This tension echoed throughout the empire. Administrative systems grew dense, legal frameworks accumulated precedent, authority became procedural. These features ensured longevity, but they also slowed response. Reform became negotiation rather than command. The state, once able to shape its institutions decisively, increasingly had to persuade them. The Janissaries embodied this paradox. They were the proof that engineered loyalty could build empire, and the warning that engineered systems, once empowered, developed their own momentum. They demonstrated that military superiority is not a static achievement, but a moving threshold. To remain dominant, institutions must not only endure, they must evolve. In the long arc of Ottoman history, the Janissary machine occupies a central place. It explains how a frontier state achieved continental reach. It reveals how war and administration fused into a single engine of expansion, and it foreshadows the challenges of reform that would define later centuries. At their peak, the Janissaries were unrivaled. They stood as the embodiment of state power, disciplined, salaried, loyal, and feared. They turned gunpowder into governance and conquest into routine. But history does not pause for institutions that refuse to adapt. As the world beyond the empire changed, economically, technologically, and politically, the Ottomans would face a reckoning not on distant battlefields alone, but within their own structures. The army that had once guaranteed supremacy would become a question rather than an answer. And as the empire moved from conquest to consolidation, from expansion to endurance, the balance between power and reform would define its next age. In the dawn of the 16th century, the Ottoman Empire no longer questioned its place in the world. It occupied it. From the plains of Hungary to the deserts of Yemen, from the shores of Algeria to the mountains of Iraq, Ottoman banners marked a political reality unmatched by any contemporary power. This was not an empire still proving itself. It was an empire convinced of its permanence, and at its center stood a ruler whose reign would come to define not only Ottoman greatness, but the very idea of imperial order. That ruler was Suleiman the Magnificent. When Suleiman ascended the throne in 1520, he inherited a state already formidable, militarily disciplined, administratively coherent, and legally sophisticated. But inheritance alone does not produce a golden age. What distinguished Suleiman was his ability to refine power rather than merely wield it. He did not expand recklessly. He consolidated deliberately. He understood that true dominance required not only conquest, but coherence, an empire that could govern itself as effectively as it conquered others. The world into which Suleiman rose was defined by rivalry among giants. In Europe, the Habsburgs sought universal monarchy. In the Mediterranean, naval powers contested control of trade and coastline. In the Islamic world, rival empires claimed legitimacy and leadership. Suleiman did not shy away from these challenges. He met them on land, at sea, and across negotiating tables with equal confidence. Militarily, the empire reached heights unseen before. Campaigns into Central Europe pushed Ottoman influence deep into the continent. Fortresses fell, frontiers advanced. Yet these victories were not isolated bursts of aggression. They were components of a long-term strategic vision that balanced expansion with sustainability. Supply lines were secured, administration followed conquest immediately. The empire did not outrun its capacity to govern. But it was not on the battlefield alone that Suleiman's greatness took shape. His most enduring legacy emerged in law. By Suleiman's time, the Ottoman legal system had grown dense, an accumulation of religious rulings, imperial decrees, and local custom. This complexity, while flexible, risked inconsistency. Suleiman responded not by dismantling tradition, but by organizing it. Laws were reviewed, harmonized, and codified. Contradictions were resolved, abuses curtailed. The legal framework became clearer, more uniform, and more predictable across the empire. This codification earned Suleiman a title that mattered as much as the Magnificent, the lawgiver. Justice was not abstract under his reign. It was visible. Judges were held accountable. Officials were monitored. Corruption, while never eliminated, was constrained by expectation and oversight. The message was clear. Power was legitimate only when exercised within known limits. Even governors were bound by law. Even soldiers were subject to discipline. This emphasis on order transformed daily life. Merchants trusted contracts. Farmers trusted land tenure. Communities trusted courts. The empire's stability became tangible, not a promise, but an experience. Economic activity expanded not through compulsion, but through confidence. Istanbul embodied this transformation. No longer merely a conquered capital, the city became a cultural and administrative beacon. Architecture flourished as an expression of imperial certainty. Mosques, bridges, schools, and public complexes reshaped the skyline, not as acts of vanity, but as statements of continuity and care. These structures were designed to endure, just like the order they represented. The court itself reflected this maturity. Scholarship was patronized. Artisans were supported. Learning moved alongside power. The empire did not define itself solely through war. It defined itself through cultivation of law, of faith, of culture. Diplomacy became as critical as armies. Suleiman corresponded with rulers across Europe and the Islamic world as an equal. Treaties were negotiated from positions of strength. The empire no longer reacted to threats, it shaped the geopolitical environment. Allies were chosen carefully, rivals were managed strategically. War was a tool, not an obsession. This balance created an atmosphere of confidence that permeated the empire. Power appeared stable, institutions functioned, expansion felt sustainable. There was little sense at the time that decline could follow such strength. To contemporaries, the Ottoman system appeared complete, its structures refined, its authority secure. Yet history rarely reveals its fractures at the height of success. Beneath this golden surface, pressures quietly accumulated. Scale introduced complexity. Institutions hardened. Adaptability would soon be tested by a changing world. But during Suleiman's reign, these challenges remained distant, overshadowed by achievement. For a generation, the Ottomans stood not as one power among many, but as the measure against which others were judged. This was the empire at full stride, confident, ordered, and seemingly eternal. Power, when untempered, consumes itself. Suleiman understood this instinctively. His reign did not glorify conquest as an end, but treated it as one instrument among many, balanced by law, diplomacy, and restraint. It was this balance that allowed the Ottoman Empire to operate at a scale unmatched by its rivals without collapsing under its own weight. Across Europe, Suleiman faced a continent in flux. Dynastic ambition collided with religious upheaval. The rise of centralized monarchies and the fractures of reform created both threats and opportunities. Suleiman navigated this terrain with calculation. He did not seek endless war with every rival. Instead, he chose moments, theaters, and terms that preserved Ottoman advantage without exhausting imperial resources. Central Europe became a stage where this strategy was most visible. Campaigns pressed northward, challenging the ambitions of the Habsburg monarchy and reshaping the political map of the region. Fortresses fell, alliances shifted, and borders stabilized not through annihilation, but through managed pressure. The Ottomans did not simply advance, they compelled negotiation. At sea, imperial confidence extended into the Mediterranean. Control of coastlines and naval routes was treated as essential to security and commerce. Naval commanders operated as extensions of state policy, not independent adventurers. Maritime power supported diplomacy, protected trade, and projected authority across distant shores. The empire was no longer land-bound. It was maritime by design. Yet even as armies marched and fleets sailed, the core of Suleiman's project remained internal. Administration under his reign reached a level of refinement rarely achieved by pre-modern states. Offices were clearly defined, responsibilities were delineated, communication between center and provinces became more regular, governors were monitored, rotation of office prevented local entrenchment, authority flowed outward, but accountability flowed back. This administrative discipline reinforced the legal reforms already underway. Codified law did not exist in isolation. It was enforced through bureaucracy. Judges relied on records, officials documented decisions, precedent accumulated. Governance became cumulative rather than reactive. The empire learned from itself. The social fabric benefited directly. Urban centers thrived under predictable rule. Guilds regulated production. Trade networks expand across imperial boundaries. Diversity, once a challenge, became a strength. Different communities specialized in different sectors, contributing to a resilient economy. Stability allowed specialization. Specialization increased productivity. Cultural life flourished alongside this order. Architecture became a language of confidence. Public works signaled permanence and care for the population. Educational institutions multiplied. Scholars debated law, philosophy, and theology within an environment that valued continuity over rupture. The empire did not fear learning, it patronized it. At the court, Ceremony reinforced hierarchy without suffocating governance. Rituals emphasized the dignity of the state rather than the whims of individuals. Power was theatrical, but it was also procedural. The ruler's presence symbolized order, not chaos. Authority felt inevitable rather than arbitrary. Diplomacy reflected this maturity. Suleiman treated foreign rulers not as existential threats, but as variables to be managed. Treaties were tools, not concessions. Peace, when advantageous, was pursued openly. War, when necessary, was conducted decisively. The empire did not need constant conflict to validate itself. This confidence extended to the empire's self-image. The Ottomans did not see themselves as one civilization among many. They saw themselves as a central pillar of global order. Their ruler corresponded as an equal with kings and emperors. Their capital attracted visitors, envoys, and merchants from across the known world. The empire radiated assurance. Yet this assurance carried risk. The very success of Suleiman's system encouraged a belief in its completeness. Institutions that functioned exceptionally well became models to be preserved rather than frameworks to be questioned. Innovation slowed not from failure, but from satisfaction. When systems work, urgency fades. Scale intensified this effect. Governing vast territories required consistency. Change introduced uncertainty. Stability became a virtue in itself. The empire's mechanisms, so carefully balanced, now resisted disruption, even when disruption might later prove necessary. But these tensions remained subtle, barely perceptible against the achievements of the age. For contemporaries, Suleiman's reign represented culmination. The empire had reached equilibrium. It had harmonized law and power, faith and governance, conquest and restraint. The Ottomans stood as Europe's equal, and in many respects, its superior. To those living within its borders, the future appeared secure. The state was strong. Justice was visible. Order was normal. History, however, rarely announces its turning points in moments of triumph. The Golden Age shimmered, complete, confident, and admired. And it was precisely this sense of completion that would define the challenges to come. By the later years of Suleiman's reign, the Ottoman Empire had reached a condition few states ever attain: equilibrium. Its borders were vast, yet stable. Its institutions were refined, yet functional. Its authority was recognized not only by subjects, but by rivals who measured their own power against it. The empire did not merely exist, it set the standard. This sense of balance shaped how the Ottomans understood time itself. History no longer felt urgent. Crisis no longer felt imminent. The state appeared complete, its mechanisms proven, its legitimacy unquestioned. In such moments, empires begin to mistake durability for permanence. Suleiman himself embodied this confidence. He ruled not as a conqueror constantly seeking validation, but as a sovereign overseeing a system that worked. Campaigns continued, but they no longer defined the reign. Law, administration, and culture carried equal weight. The ruler's presence was less about assertion and more about maintenance. Power had matured. This maturity altered succession dynamics as well. The state had grown so complex that continuity mattered more than brilliance. Stability required predictability. Institutions were designed to function regardless of personality. In theory, this insulated the empire from weak rulers. In practice, it also reduced the pressure to cultivate exceptional ones. Within the bureaucracy, experience accumulated into precedent. Procedures hardened. Offices became careers. Knowledge passed through documentation rather than improvisation. This professionalism enhanced consistency, but it also narrowed imagination. Change, when proposed, had to justify itself against a long record of success. The military reflected this shift. Its structures were formidable, its traditions revered. Victories of the past became reference points rather than lessons. Adaptation slowed, not because of failure, but because of confidence in methods that had worked before. The empire's strength lay in its ability to reproduce success, but reproduction is not innovation. Culturally, the Golden Age left an enduring imprint. Architecture reshaped cities into statements of order and faith. Educational institutions preserved knowledge and transmitted it forward. Artistic patronage flourished within stable forms. These achievements were not fragile. They would endure long after the reign ended. Yet cultural confidence also reinforced conservatism. Forms perfected were forms preserved. Experimentation yielded to refinement. The empire invested in continuity rather than reinvention. This was not stagnation. It was consolidation. But consolidation carries a hidden cost. It reduces responsiveness to a world that does not stand still. Beyond Ottoman borders, that world was already shifting. Europe moved toward new economic models, new military techniques, and new political ideas. Maritime trade routes altered the flow of wealth. Scientific inquiry began to challenge inherited assumptions. These changes were gradual, uneven, and distant, but they were real. During Suleiman's lifetime, they did not yet threaten Ottoman dominance. The empire's scale, resources, and institutional depth absorbed shocks easily. Rivals remained reactive. No single power could match Ottoman reach. From the perspective of the 16th century, the system appeared unassailable. This perception shaped decision-making. Reform was incremental, innovation cautious. The empire prioritized balance over transformation. In the short term, this preserved stability. In the long term, it would complicate adaptation. The irony of Suleiman's golden age lies here. The very success that elevated the empire also fixed its self-image. The Ottomans came to see their system not as one arrangement among many, but as the culmination of governance itself. When change later became necessary, it would be interpreted not as evolution, but as deviation. Yet none of this diminishes the magnitude of the achievement. For nearly half a century, the Ottoman Empire functioned at a level of coherence rare in human history. It governed vast diversity without constant rebellion. It balanced law and power without collapsing into despotism. It expanded without outrunning administration. It cultivated culture without weakening authority. Suleiman's reign did not merely represent peak territory. It represented peak confidence. The empire believed in itself, and that belief was shared by those who lived under its rule and those who faced it from beyond its borders. When Suleiman died in 1566, the empire did not falter. Institutions continued, armies marched, courts functioned, life went on. This continuity was itself a testament to the system he had refined. The state did not depend on one man, it depended on what he had stabilized. But history is not governed by balance alone. It is governed by momentum, adaptation, and pressure from beyond familiar horizons. The Ottomans would soon discover that maintaining greatness is a different challenge than achieving it. The Golden Age did not end in collapse. It faded into routine, and routine, while powerful, is vulnerable to a changing world. For from the heights of confidence, the empire would now enter a long season of endurance, where holding ground mattered more than gaining it, and the test was no longer how to rise, but how to remain. When Suleiman died, the empire did not shatter. That fact alone would have astonished earlier generations. For centuries, states had lived and died by the strength of singular rulers. Weak succession often meant fragmentation, civil war, or conquest. The Ottomans avoided this fate, not because they were immune to instability, but because they had built institutions strong enough to absorb it. Yet endurance is not the same as advance. In the decades following Suleiman's reign, The Ottoman Empire entered a new historical condition, one defined not by rise or fall, but by suspension. Borders largely stabilized. Conquests became rarer, slower, and more costly. The empire still appeared formidable, but its movement had changed direction. Instead of expanding outward, it turned inward, toward management, ceremony, and preservation. This shift was not immediately visible. Armies still marched, taxes were still collected, courts still functioned. From a distance, the imperial machine appeared intact. But beneath the surface, the logic of power was changing. Succession became the first pressure point. Earlier, Ottoman rulers had combined battlefield leadership with political authority. They led campaigns personally, forged loyalty through victory, and commanded respect through presence. After Suleiman, this pattern weakened. Sultans increasingly ruled from the palace rather than the field. Command passed to generals, authority became mediated through layers of officials. This distance altered perception. The ruler remained sacred and supreme, but less visible. Power felt ceremonial rather than kinetic. Decisions slowed, responsibility diffused. The empire continued, but its tempo slackened. Within the palace, politics intensified. As rulers withdrew from direct command, competition for influence shifted inward. Court factions multiplied. Advisors, family members, and officials maneuvered for proximity to power. Succession disputes became more frequent and more disruptive. Where earlier transitions had been brutal but decisive, later ones grew cautious, prolonged, and politicized. This internal focus had consequences. Energy once spent on conquest and reform now flowed into preservation of status. Stability became an end in itself. Risk was avoided. Innovation hesitated. The military reflected this change acutely. The Janissaries, once the engine of expansion, had become an entrenched institution with privileges to protect. Their influence within the capital grew. Their role in succession politics deepened. Reform proposals, especially those threatening pay, status, or tradition, met resistance. The army that had once enforced central authority now constrained it. Meanwhile, beyond Ottoman borders, the world accelerated. European states began reorganizing their militaries, experimenting with new drill systems, logistics, and technology. Scientific inquiry reshaped navigation, artillery, and engineering. Economies shifted toward global trade networks that bypassed traditional land routes. These changes were gradual, but cumulative. The Ottomans were not unaware of them. They observed, adapted selectively, and responded where necessary. But adaptation lacked urgency. The empire's size and resources absorbed inefficiency. Victory was no longer required to maintain legitimacy. Continuity sufficed. Wealth continued to flow. The empire controlled fertile lands, major trade corridors, and populous cities. Revenue remained substantial, but wealth does not guarantee effectiveness. Administration grew heavier. Offices multiplied, procedures layered upon procedures. The system functioned, but less efficiently with each generation. This is where the distinction matters. The Ottomans did not enter sudden decline. They did not collapse under invasion or rebellion. Instead, they plateaued. Their institutions, designed for expansion, now focused on maintenance. Their traditions, once adaptive, became conservative. Their success became a shield against urgency. Ceremony masked stagnation. Court ritual grew elaborate. Titles multiplied. The language of power remained confident, even absolute. Yet these symbols increasingly represented continuity rather than command. Authority endured, but initiative waned. To contemporaries within the empire, this did not feel like decay. Life remained stable. Order persisted. For many subjects, Ottoman rule continued to offer predictability unmatched elsewhere. The system still worked, just not as dynamically as before. History, however, judges empires not only by whether they survive, but by whether they adapt. The long plateau was not an age of collapse. It was an age of inertia. And inertia, while powerful, is dangerous in a world that does not stand still. The empire had reached a height so commanding that it mistook balance for finality. It did not yet see the cost of standing still. That realization would come later, slowly, unevenly, and with consequences that would unfold over centuries. The Ottoman system did not break under pressure. It absorbed it, and for a time that absorption looked like strength. As expansion slowed, the empire leaned on scale. Vast territory compensated for inefficiency. Large populations sustained tax revenue even as productivity per unit declined. The state no longer needed dramatic victories to project power. Its very size deterred challengers. Neighbors calculated risk carefully. Rebellion remained costly. From the outside, the empire still looked immovable. Internally, however, the mechanics of governance were changing character. Bureaucracy thickened. Offices multiplied. Procedures accumulated. What had once been adaptive administration gradually hardened into routine. Decisions that once traveled quickly now passed through layers of consultation. Authority dispersed across councils, courts, and officials whose primary incentive was preservation rather than transformation. The system became excellent at maintaining itself and increasingly hesitant to change itself. This hesitation shaped policy. Military reform proposals emerged periodically, often inspired by observation of European developments. New artillery designs, revised training methods, restructured command hierarchies, all were discussed. Some were tested, few were fully implemented. Resistance came not only from entrenched military interests, but from administrative caution. Reform carried risk. Stability did not. The Janissaries stood at the center of this tension. Their historical role as guardians of the capital and arbiters of legitimacy made them politically sensitive. Their resistance to reform was not ideological alone, it was institutional. Change threatened identity, privilege, and influence. The state, dependent on their presence, negotiated rather than commanded. This negotiation extended into succession politics. As palace dynamics grew more complex, factions sought military support to secure outcomes. The army became both protector and participant in political process. Authority was still centralized, but it was no longer uncontested. Power required coalition. Yet for centuries, this arrangement held. Why? Because the empire's inertia was enormous. Trade continued across established routes. Agriculture sustained cities. Legal frameworks preserved order. Religious communities governed themselves under imperial oversight. For most subjects, daily life remained predictable. The absence of dramatic reform did not equate to chaos. In fact, it often felt like reassurance. This perception mattered. Empires survive not only by adapting, but by convincing populations that continuity is preferable to uncertainty. The Ottomans excelled at this. Their rituals, titles, and institutions communicated permanence. The state appeared eternal, even when its internal efficiency eroded. Beyond the empire, however, the world recalibrated. European states increasingly tied military power to fiscal innovation. Standing armies were paired with centralized taxation, credit systems, and industrial capacity. Naval power expanded alongside global trade. Wealth shifted from land-based empires toward maritime networks. These changes did not immediately eclipse Ottoman strength, but they altered the direction of advantage. The Ottomans responded selectively. They observed new technologies, adopted some, ignored others. They sent envoys, they studied rivals. But adaptation was piecemeal. There was no unified sense of urgency. The empire's long memory of success dulled the impulse to overhaul systems that still functioned. This selective adaptation created uneven outcomes. In some regions, governors experimented with reform. In others, tradition held firm. The center tolerated variation so long as order was maintained. Uniformity mattered less than control. This flexibility preserved peace, but it also fragmented progress. Economically, wealth continued to circulate, but inefficiencies multiplied. Tax farming expanded. Revenue collection became less direct. Middlemen proliferated. Corruption, though never absent, became harder to police across such scale. The system still delivered income, but at increasing cost. None of this signaled imminent collapse. That is the crucial distinction of the Long Plateau. The empire did not decline in a straight line. It endured through mass, memory, and momentum. Its institutions, designed for longevity, performed exactly as intended, just not at the pace of a changing world. Ceremony grew more elaborate as initiative slowed. Ritual compensated for momentum. The image of power remained vivid even as its mechanism stiffened. To contemporaries, the empire still appeared central to global affairs. To historians looking back, the shift is clearer. Dominance had given way to management. This condition is rare and dangerous. Empires usually fall when they cannot absorb shock. The Ottomans absorbed shock so well that they delayed transformation. They survived crises that would have destroyed smaller states. They endured defeats that would have ended others. But survival became the measure of success, replacing adaptation. The Long Plateau was not failure, it was postponement. The empire stood vast and intact, but increasingly reactive. It responded to events rather than shaping them. Its systems preserved order rather than driving change. For centuries, this was enough. But history does not pause for systems that stand still. Eventually, the costs of inertia accumulate. What once felt like stability begins to feel like strain. The balance between preservation and progress tightens. And when that balance breaks, the reckoning is rarely sudden, but it is rarely avoidable. The Ottomans were still powerful, but the age of effortless dominance had ended. By the time the 17th century matured, the Ottoman Empire had entered a paradoxical phase of its existence. It was still vast. It was still feared. It still governed millions across 3 continents. And yet, it no longer set the pace of history. The empire endured, but endurance had replaced ambition. This distinction defines the Long Plateau. The Ottomans did not lose their territories in waves. They did not fall to a single rival or internal revolt. Instead, they remained solid, imposing, and increasingly reactive. Their power was real, but it was no longer directional. The empire held ground better than it gained it. This endurance rested on deep structural foundations. Legal systems continued to function. Administrative routines preserved order. Religious communities managed internal affairs. Markets operated under predictable rules. The empire's institutional depth buffered it against sudden collapse. Defeats were absorbed. Crises were managed. Reforms were delayed, but not entirely absent. Yet each delay carried cost. As European powers refined military organization and fiscal capacity, the gap in efficiency widened. The Ottomans still fielded large armies, but mobilization grew slower. Logistics became heavier. Command chains lengthened. Victory required more effort and yielded fewer gains. Warfare shifted from expansion to containment. Internally, the political culture adapted to this new reality. Palace politics grew more intricate. Influence replaced initiative. Stability became the overriding priority. Decisions favored short-term equilibrium over long-term transformation. This was not irrational. The empire's size made radical change dangerous, but caution accumulated into inertia. The military's role in politics deepened further. Institutions designed to protect the state increasingly shaped its direction. Reform proposals were filtered through entrenched interests. Compromise replaced command. Authority remained centralized, but constrained by negotiation with its own pillars. Economic patterns mirrored this shift. Revenue remained substantial, but extraction became less efficient. Tax farming expanded. Corruption spread through intermediaries. The state still functioned, but with diminishing returns. Wealth flowed, but less of it reached the center. Investment lagged, infrastructure aged. And yet, for centuries, the empire held. This endurance misled observers and participants alike. Stability masked erosion, ceremony concealed strain. The absence of collapse suggested health. In reality, the empire had entered a phase where survival depended increasingly on past strength rather than present innovation. To its subjects, life often remained preferable under Ottoman rule than under alternatives. Order persisted. Law remained legible. Communities retained autonomy. The state still delivered predictability in a volatile world. These qualities mattered deeply and sustained loyalty long after momentum slowed. This is why the empire did not fall quickly. The Ottomans had built a system designed for longevity. Its very success delayed reckoning. But longevity without renewal is a finite resource. Over time, external pressures intensified. Rivals modernized. Trade routes shifted. Economic centers moved. Military technology evolved. The empire responded, but unevenly. Some reforms succeeded, others failed. Many arrived too late or lacked scope. The balance between tradition and change grew harder to maintain. Each attempt at adjustment encountered resistance from institutions shaped by centuries of stability. The Long Plateau, in hindsight, was both triumph and warning. It demonstrated the extraordinary resilience of Ottoman governance. Few states in history have endured so long without radical reinvention. But it also illustrated the limits of inertia. Stability preserved the empire, but it did not prepare it for a world accelerating beyond its inherited rhythms. By the end of this phase, the Ottomans remained an empire, but no longer the empire. They had moved from central actor to one power among many. Their voice still carried weight, but it no longer set terms. The future would demand a new response, one that confronted decline not as collapse, but as challenge. Reform would become unavoidable. Adaptation would become existential. The Long Plateau had bought time. What the empire would do with that time would determine its fate. For beyond endurance lay a harder question: whether an empire built to last could also learn to change. By the 18th century, the world surrounding the Ottoman Empire had begun to move at a different speed. For generations, the Ottomans had governed through balance, between law and faith, center and periphery, tradition and pragmatism. That balance had sustained them through the Long Plateau. But beyond their borders, particularly in Europe, power was being redefined. States were centralizing more aggressively. Economies were reorganizing around industry and capital. Armies were becoming instruments of science as much as discipline. The Ottomans were no longer confronting rivals who played by familiar rules. European monarchies increasingly tied military strength to fiscal innovation. Standing armies were supported by centralized taxation, state credit, and expanding manufacturing. Artillery improved rapidly. Drill systems became standardized. Logistics were rationalized. War was no longer seasonal. It was systemic. The Ottoman military, once revolutionary, struggled to keep pace. Defeats that would once have been temporary setbacks now revealed deeper problems. Battles exposed technological gaps. Sieges took longer. Campaigns drained resources without decisive results. The empire could still fight, but it could no longer dictate the terms of conflict. These encounters were not confined to the battlefield. Economically, the empire faced mounting pressure through a system of agreements known as capitulations. Originally granted to encourage trade, these arrangements offered European merchants favorable legal and tax privileges within Ottoman territory. Over time, What had been pragmatic concessions hardened into structural disadvantage. Foreign merchants operated under their own laws. Local producers faced unequal competition. Revenue leaked outward. Sovereignty, while intact in theory, eroded in practice. The empire's markets became integrated into European commercial networks, but on unequal terms. This imbalance altered internal dynamics. Urban elites increasingly depended on foreign trade. Local economies adjusted to external demand rather than imperial planning. The state, constrained by existing institutions and fiscal habits, struggled to respond decisively. Reform was discussed, but hesitation prevailed. Each concession created precedent. Each precedent limited options. At the same time, ideas crossed borders alongside goods. European political thought, shaped by concepts of nationhood, citizenship, and popular sovereignty, began to circulate within Ottoman lands. These ideas did not arrive uniformly. They filtered through schools, trade centers, and minority communities with connections to Europe. For populations long organized around religious and communal identity, nationalism introduced a new framework of belonging. This posed a fundamental challenge to imperial logic. The Ottoman system had been built on managed diversity. Communities were defined by faith and governed through autonomy under imperial oversight. Nationalism redefined identity around language, culture, and territory, categories that cut across the empire's legal architecture. Loyalty to the state now competed with loyalty to imagined nations. The balance that had once ensured stability began to strain. Some communities sought greater autonomy. Others looked outward for protection. European powers, eager to expand influence, presented themselves as patrons of co-religionists within Ottoman borders. Intervention followed rhetoric. Sovereignty was contested not through invasion alone, but through diplomacy and pressure. Within the Ottoman elite, awareness of crisis grew. Reform was no longer optional. Military modernization, fiscal restructuring, administrative overhaul, all were debated with urgency unknown in earlier centuries. But reform threatened entrenched interests. Military institutions resisted change. Bureaucratic elites feared loss of position. Local power holders opposed centralization. The empire faced a dilemma with no easy resolution. To remain unchanged meant falling further behind. To change meant destabilizing the very structures that preserved order. Every reform proposal carried risk. Every delay carried cost. The state oscillated between experimentation and retreat. Yet it would be wrong to see this period as simple decline. The Ottomans were not passive. They observed, learned, and selectively adapted. Envoys were sent, schools were founded, military techniques were studied. But adaptation lacked coherence. Reform arrived unevenly, often compromised by negotiation with resistant institutions. Encounters with Europe did not destroy the empire, but they exposed its limits. The Ottomans were no longer setting the pace of history. They were reacting to it. Their power endured, but it was increasingly conditional, increasingly contested, and increasingly defined by comparison rather than confidence. The age of unquestioned dominance was over. A new era had begun, one in which survival would depend not on balance alone, but on transformation. As the 19th century approached, the Ottoman state found itself confronting a reality it could no longer manage through precedent alone. The encounters with Europe had shifted from episodic confrontation to continuous comparison. Every treaty, every military engagement, every commercial agreement reinforced an uncomfortable truth. The rules of power had changed, and the empire had not changed fast enough. Military defeats were the most visible warning. Campaigns that once would have ended in negotiated stalemate now ended in forced concessions. European armies moved faster, coordinated better, and sustained longer operations. Artillery was more precise, logistics more reliable, command structures clearer. Ottoman forces still fought with courage and numbers, but effectiveness increasingly depended on reforms that threatened entrenched institutions. These defeats did not immediately dismantle the empire, but they altered its psychology. For the first time, Ottoman leaders began to speak openly of backwardness in comparison to Europe. This was not an admission of inferiority, but an acknowledgement of divergence. The empire had perfected an earlier model of governance. Europe was now refining a different one, centralized, industrial, and aggressively standardized. The response was reform, but reform arrived cautiously and often too late. Military modernization became the entry point. New training methods were proposed, foreign advisors consulted, modern academies established, uniforms changed, drill manuals translated. Yet implementation was uneven. Old units resisted replacement. New formations lacked institutional support. Reform collided with tradition at every step. Beyond the army, fiscal realities pressed harder. European-style warfare required capital, credit, industry, and taxation systems capable of sustaining prolonged campaigns. The Ottoman treasury, long accustomed to land-based revenue and indirect collection, struggled to adapt. Borrowing increased, debt mounted, financial dependence deepened the empire's vulnerability to external pressure. Economic concessions compounded the problem. The capitulations, once tools of diplomacy, now functioned as constraints. Foreign merchants enjoyed legal protections denied to local producers. Courts lost jurisdiction. Tariff autonomy eroded. The state's ability to shape its own economy weakened not through conquest, but through agreement. Sovereignty, once absolute, became conditional. At the same time, nationalist movements gained momentum within imperial borders. Communities that had long been governed through religious identity began to reimagine themselves as nations. Language, history, and culture replaced faith as organizing principles. This shift did not occur uniformly, but where it took root, it destabilized the imperial framework. The Ottoman system had been designed to manage difference, not fragmentation. Communal autonomy functioned as long as loyalty flowed upward to the state. Nationalism redirected loyalty horizontally toward shared identity across borders. Rebellion was no longer framed as heresy or disorder, but as liberation. The language of reform competed with the language of revolution. European powers exploited this shift skillfully. Intervention was justified in the name of protecting minorities or restoring order. Diplomatic pressure followed internal unrest. Treaties reshaped borders. Each crisis invited external involvement. The empire's internal challenges became international leverage points. Within the Ottoman elite, divisions sharpened. Some argued that only radical reform could save the state: centralization, uniform law, standardized education, and a modern army. Others warned that such reforms would tear apart the delicate balance holding the empire together. Tradition versus transformation became the defining debate of the age. The state attempted compromise. Reforms were introduced incrementally, designed to modernize without provoking revolt. New schools trained officials in European methods. Legal changes promised equality before the law. Administrative structures were revised. But these reforms unsettled established hierarchies. Privilege was questioned, authority redistributed. Resistance followed. The empire found itself reforming under duress rather than vision. Every change was framed as response, not initiative. Each reform addressed a symptom rather than the system. Progress occurred, but it lacked coherence. The state moved but hesitantly, constrained by fear of collapse and haunted by memory of past stability. And yet the Ottomans persisted. They negotiated. They adapted. They survived crises that would have destroyed less resilient states. Their institutions bent, but did not break. The empire remained a player in global politics, even as its autonomy narrowed. Encounters with Europe did not immediately doom the Ottoman Empire. They transformed it. The state was no longer insulated by scale or tradition. It was now embedded in a competitive international order, that demanded efficiency, standardization, and speed. The old balance, so effective for centuries, now produced fragmentation under new pressures. Reform was no longer a choice. It was a gamble. And the outcome of that gamble would determine whether the empire could reinvent itself, or whether survival itself would become unsustainable. By the middle of the 19th century, the Ottoman Empire stood at a crossroads where every path carried risk. The world it had mastered no longer existed. The world replacing it demanded speed, uniformity, and industrial capacity, qualities that clashed with an imperial system built on balance, accommodation, and layered authority. What had once been strengths now revealed their limits. The empire's flexibility, its ability to manage difference without force, became vulnerability when confronted with nationalism. The legal autonomy once granted to religious communities had fostered stability. Now it provided organizational scaffolding for separatist movements. Schools, churches, and communal councils became incubators of national consciousness. Loyalty fractured along lines the empire had never needed to police before. This fragmentation was not instantaneous. It unfolded unevenly, region by region, crisis by crisis, but its direction was unmistakable. The state responded with reform, not as vision, but as necessity. New laws promised equality across faiths. Administrative boundaries were redrawn. Central authority pressed outward, seeking to standardize governance where autonomy had long prevailed. These measures aimed to create common citizenship, a unified legal identity that could replace communal allegiance. But reform carried paradox. Equality threatened privilege. Centralization threatened local authority. Uniform law unsettled traditions that had defined daily life for centuries. In trying to modernize, the empire destabilized the social contracts that had sustained it. Resistance followed from unexpected quarters, not only from conservative elites or entrenched military institutions, but from communities that feared losing autonomy in exchange for abstract promises of citizenship. Reform meant to bind the empire together, sometimes accelerated disintegration by stripping away the familiar before replacing it with the functional. Externally, pressure intensified. European powers no longer viewed the Ottoman Empire as a peer competitor. They viewed it as a strategic space, an arena for influence, intervention, and advantage. Diplomacy became coercive. Treaties favored foreign interests. Economic dependence deepened through loans and concessions. The empire remained sovereign in name, but its freedom of action narrowed. The phrase "the Eastern Question" entered European political vocabulary, a term that reduced the fate of a living empire to a problem to be managed. Its internal crises became international negotiations. Its borders became bargaining chips. Its survival depended increasingly on the calculations of others. This externalization of fate marked a profound shift. For centuries, the Ottomans had shaped regional order. Now, regional order shaped them. Internally, leadership struggled to keep pace with cascading challenges. Reformers argued for acceleration, more radical restructuring, deeper centralization, faster modernization. Traditionalists warned of rupture. Compromise produced half measures. Progress came, but it was fragmented, uneven, and often reversed under pressure. The empire adapted, but not cohesively. Military reforms improved certain units while leaving others untouched. Administrative changes standardized some provinces while alienating others. Legal reforms promised equality while exposing inequality in practice. Each improvement revealed another fault line. Yet through all of this, the empire endured. That endurance itself became misleading. Survival was interpreted as validation. Each crisis weathered reinforced the belief that the system could absorb anything. But absorption is not adaptation. The empire was surviving through structural memory rather than structural renewal, living off accumulated authority rather than generating new momentum. By the late 19th century, the Ottomans remained an empire, but an empire increasingly defined by defense rather than direction. They responded to events rather than initiating them. They negotiated decline rather than prevented it. Their sovereignty persisted, but it was contested, conditional, and fragile. Encounters with Europe had done what centuries of warfare could not. They had exposed the limits of balance in an age that rewarded standardization. The Ottomans were not defeated outright. They were outpaced. And in being outpaced, they were forced into a race against time, one in which every reform risked collapse and every delay invited further erosion. The empire now faced its most difficult challenge yet: how to reinvent itself without destroying the fragile coherence that still held it together. The future would no longer be decided on distant battlefields alone. It would be decided in laws, schools, treasuries, and identities. For the age of encounter had ended, and the age of reckoning was about to begin. By the dawn of the 19th century, the Ottoman Empire could no longer delay what history had been demanding for generations. The age of accommodation and inertia had reached its limits. Survival itself now required transformation, not gradual adjustment, not selective borrowing, but deliberate reform. The empire stood before a stark reality: modernize or be dismantled piece by piece by a faster-moving world. This realization did not emerge from ideology. It emerged from crisis. Military defeats exposed structural weakness. European armies no longer merely outperformed Ottoman forces. They operated on entirely different principles. Centralized command, standardized training, industrial logistics, and disciplined conscription had reshaped warfare. The Ottomans could still raise armies, but they could not sustain parity. Each conflict drained resources without restoring confidence. Fiscal pressure followed closely behind. War required money, vast sums of it. The traditional mechanisms of revenue extraction proved inadequate. Tax farming produced inconsistency. Corruption diluted income. Foreign loans became unavoidable, binding the empire ever tighter to European creditors. Sovereignty eroded quietly, not through invasion, but through dependency. Within the imperial court, debate sharpened into urgency. Some officials argued that only radical reform could preserve the state: a centralized bureaucracy, standardized law, modern education, and a restructured military modeled on European systems. Others warned that such measures would destroy the delicate social balance that still held the empire together. The memory of past stability haunted every decision. Reform promised salvation, but also rupture. It was within this tension that a new era began. In 1839, the Ottoman state formally announced a program of transformation known as the Tanzimat, literally reorganization. The declaration did not overthrow tradition, it reframed it. The empire publicly acknowledged that survival required systemic change. At its core, the Tanzimat sought to redefine the relationship between state and subject. Equality before the law was proclaimed, regardless of religion. Life, property, and honor were promised protection under a unified legal framework. Arbitrary punishment was condemned. Taxation was to be standardized. Military service regulated. For the first time, the empire articulated a concept approaching common citizenship. This was revolutionary, not in language alone, but in implication. The Ottoman system had long governed diversity through difference. Communities were autonomous, bound by faith and custom, rather than shared civic identity. The Tanzimat challenged this architecture. It proposed uniformity of rights where plurality had once prevailed. The intention was cohesion. The risk was alienation. New institutions followed: Modern ministries replaced older, personalized offices. Bureaucrats were trained in new schools modeled on European systems. Legal codes were revised, military academies expanded, communication improved. The state attempted to make itself legible, to standardize authority across vast territory. At the center of this transformation stood Abdul-Mejid I, the Sultan who endorsed the Tanzimat reforms. His reign symbolized the empire's attempt to reconcile tradition with necessity. Reform was no longer clandestine or experimental, it was official policy. Yet reform did not move unopposed. Resistance emerged from multiple directions. Conservative elites feared erosion of privilege. Religious authorities worried about the dilution of sacred law. Military institutions resisted restructuring. Local power holders opposed centralization that threatened their autonomy. Even communities promised equality hesitated, uncertain what they would lose in exchange. The empire attempted compromise. Reforms were introduced incrementally, carefully worded to avoid provoking revolt. Old institutions were layered with new ones rather than dismantled. Tradition was preserved alongside innovation. This caution preserved short-term stability, but slowed transformation. Externally, pressure intensified. European powers monitored reforms closely, intervening diplomatically whenever internal unrest occurred. Under the language of protection, of minorities, of order, of reform, they asserted influence. Each intervention reduced imperial autonomy. The empire survived, but its freedom to act narrowed. The Tanzimat marked a decisive shift in Ottoman history. For the first time, reform was no longer reactive improvisation. It was articulated as doctrine. The state admitted that its inherited systems were insufficient for the modern world, yet admission did not guarantee execution. Reform arrived constrained by fear. Fear of collapse, fear of resistance, fear of moving too far, too fast. Modernization had begun, but it had begun late and under pressure. The question that now loomed was whether reform could outpace erosion, or whether resistance, internal and external, would hollow it out before it could take root. The Tanzimat reforms promised a new order, but promises alone do not transform empires. Implementation would decide whether the Ottoman state could translate intention into endurance, and it was here, between proclamation and practice, that the empire encountered its most stubborn obstacles. Reform moved unevenly across the imperial landscape. In the capital, ministries expanded, regulations multiplied, and a new class of bureaucrats emerged, educated, salaried, and increasingly oriented toward European models of governance. Paperwork replaced personal decree, procedures replaced precedent, authority became codified, the state appeared to modernize. In the provinces, the picture was different. Local power holders resisted centralization that threatened their autonomy. Tax farmers resisted standardized collection that endangered profits. Judges accustomed to customary practice hesitated before new codes. The empire's size amplified inconsistency. Reform traveled slowly, filtered through negotiation, compromise, and delay. Equality before the law, one of the Tanzimat's most radical commitments, proved especially difficult to realize. In theory, Muslims and non-Muslims now stood equal as subjects. In practice, social hierarchy did not dissolve overnight. Legal equality clashed with lived inequality. Communities accustomed to autonomy worried that uniform citizenship would erase long-held privileges and protections. What was offered as inclusion felt to some like intrusion. Religious authorities voiced concern. The reforms did not abolish Islamic law, but they reduced its exclusive authority. Secular courts expanded. New legal codes addressed commerce, crime, and procedure. While framed as complementary, these changes diluted the centrality of religious jurisprudence. For scholars who had long anchored legitimacy in sacred law, this shift threatened both influence and identity. The military posed another challenge. Modernization required restructuring, new training, new command hierarchies, and new discipline. but entrenched institutions resisted change that undermined status and tradition. Earlier attempts at reform had already revealed how dangerous military resistance could be. Caution prevailed. Reformers negotiated rather than commanded, compromising effectiveness for stability. This pattern repeated across the empire. Reform advanced, but slowly, cautiously, and often inconsistently. Each success revealed a new obstacle. Each compromise preserved order while weakening impact. The state moved, but not with the momentum required to match external change. Meanwhile, European pressure intensified. Every internal disturbance invited foreign scrutiny. Uprisings, protests, or communal tensions were framed as humanitarian crises requiring intervention. Diplomacy became leverage. Treaties imposed conditions, loans carried strings. The empire's reforms, meant to strengthen sovereignty, increasingly became grounds for external involvement. This paradox haunted the Tanzimat era. The Ottomans reformed to survive in a European-dominated order, but reform itself opened doors to European influence. Equality clauses empowered foreign powers to claim protective rights over minority populations. Legal changes exposed judicial systems to external comparison and critique. Economic reforms tied the empire more tightly to global markets it did not control. Autonomy eroded not through conquest, but through entanglement. Within the ruling elite, frustration grew. Reformers argued that half measures doomed the project. Traditionalists argued that reform itself caused instability. Each camp blamed the other for setbacks. Consensus fractured. Leadership changed. Policies shifted. Continuity suffered. Yet despite these struggles, the empire did not unravel. Institutions endured, administration improved in pockets, education expanded, communication networks grew. A new generation of officials emerged, fluent in European languages, trained in modern methods, and conscious of the empire's precarious position. Reform planted seeds, even if growth was slow. The deeper problem lay in timing. The Tanzimat reforms addressed a world that had already moved ahead. They sought to reconcile tradition with modernity at a moment when competitors had already reorganized around industrial production, mass conscription, and centralized finance. The empire was not merely catching up, it was chasing a moving target. This chase strained legitimacy. To conservatives, reform appeared as betrayal of heritage. To reformers, resistance appeared as self-sabotage. To subject populations, change arrived inconsistently, promising equality while delivering uncertainty. Trust eroded across multiple fronts. Yet the Ottomans persisted in reform, not because success was assured, but because alternatives had vanished. The state could not return to the old balance. It could not fully embrace the new order. It existed in between, modernizing without rupture, reforming without revolution. This liminal condition defined the age. The empire survived, but it did so by conceding ground, politically, economically, and diplomatically. Each reform stabilized one pressure point while exposing another. Progress came at the cost of autonomy. Stability came at the cost of momentum. By mid-century, the Ottomans had changed profoundly, but not decisively. They had begun the work of modernization, but too late and too cautiously to reverse the long-term trend. Reform slowed decline, but it could not restore supremacy. The question that remained was whether survival itself was victory or merely delay. By the final decades of the 19th century, the Ottoman Empire had become something unprecedented in its own history, a state consciously attempting to remake itself while still alive. This was not collapse nor revolution. It was renovation under occupation of the mind, pressed by external models, constrained by internal memory, and haunted by the fear that moving too fast might shatter what still held. The Tanzimat era had changed the empire irreversibly. Ministries replaced courts of patronage. Written law expanded where custom once ruled. Education produced officials fluent in European languages and methods. Railways cut across provinces that had once been bound only by caravan routes. Telegraph lines compressed distance. The state became more legible to itself. Yet legibility did not equal control. The empire modernized its surfaces faster than its foundations. New institutions often sat atop older power structures without fully replacing them. Centralization advanced, but unevenly. In some provinces, reform empowered the state. In others, it provoked resistance or invited foreign interference. Uniformity remained an aspiration rather than a reality. Equality before the law, the moral centerpiece of reform, proved especially fragile. Proclaimed in edicts and celebrated in theory, it clashed with centuries of social hierarchy and communal governance. Muslims questioned parity with non-Muslims. Non-Muslims questioned whether equality meant loss of protection without real power. The empire promised citizenship, but delivered it through structures still shaped by difference. Trust, once grounded in tradition, now struggled to find new footing. Externally, Europe did not wait for Ottoman reforms to mature. Loans deepened dependence, financial oversight tightened, economic sovereignty weakened. Capitulations, already entrenched, expanded in effect. The empire's markets were increasingly shaped by foreign capital and demand. Reform stabilized the state internally while binding it externally. This contradiction defined the age. Modernization was meant to preserve independence, but often accelerated entanglement. Each reform aligned the empire more closely with European norms, inviting comparison and judgment. Failure to meet those standards justified intervention. Success, when achieved, rarely translated into regained autonomy. Leadership struggled within this narrowing corridor. Sultans and ministers oscillated between reformist ambition and conservative caution. Too much change risked revolt. Too little invited partition. Authority was exercised defensively, shaped by reaction rather than vision. The empire governed crises rather than trajectories. And yet, it endured. That endurance deserves emphasis. Despite internal resistance, despite external pressure, despite fiscal strain and political fragmentation, the Ottoman state did not disintegrate in the 19th century. It adapted enough to survive. It absorbed shocks that would have destroyed lesser systems. It maintained order across vast territories even as its freedom of action diminished. This survival, however, came at a price. Reform arrived late and therefore defensively. It was shaped by fear of loss rather than confidence of gain. Innovation was negotiated rather than commanded. The empire modernized without mastering modernity, adopting forms without fully controlling their function. The deeper problem was not ignorance, but timing. Had these reforms emerged at the height of imperial confidence, they might have transformed strength into renewal. Arriving after centuries of plateau and pressure, they instead slowed decline without reversing direction. The state gained time, but not momentum. By the end of the Tanzimat era, the Ottoman Empire stood transformed yet constrained. It possessed modern institutions without modern autonomy. It claimed equality without full integration. It sought sovereignty within an international system increasingly hostile to its survival. Reform had preserved the empire, but it had not liberated it. This was the tragedy of Ottoman modernization. It succeeded just enough to delay collapse, but not enough to prevent it. The empire had learned how to change, but not how to change faster than the forces arrayed against it. What followed would test the limits of this survival. The age of reform had stabilized the present. It had not secured the future. And as the 19th century drew toward its end, a new question emerged, no longer about how to modernize, but about whether an empire forged for balance could survive an age that rewarded rupture. For beyond reform lay confrontation, and beyond confrontation, the final reckoning of an imperial century. By the early 20th century, the Ottoman Empire no longer lived in the present tense of power. It lived in the conditional. For decades, it had survived through reform, diplomacy, and endurance, losing ground slowly, conceding authority cautiously, yet remaining intact through sheer institutional memory. But the world was now entering an age where survival demanded more than resilience. It demanded alignment, speed, and industrial capacity. The Ottomans possessed none in sufficient measure. When Europe slid toward total war in 1914, the empire stood at a crossroads it could not avoid. Neutrality promised safety, but also isolation. Alignment promised protection, but at catastrophic risk. The Ottoman leadership, fragmented and under pressure, faced an impossible calculus: remain outside a conflict reshaping the global order or enter it in hopes of preserving relevance and sovereignty. They chose war. By joining World War I, the Ottoman Empire made its final gamble, not for expansion, not for dominance, but for survival. The decision was driven less by confidence than by fear. Fear that a victorious alliance would dismantle the empire regardless of its participation. Fear that neutrality would invite partition without resistance. The war the Ottomans entered was unlike any they had fought before. It was industrial, total, and unforgiving. It consumed economies as thoroughly as armies. Railways, factories, and supply chains mattered as much as soldiers. Victory depended on coordination across vast fronts and sustained production, areas where the empire was weakest. Almost immediately, strain appeared. Mobilization drained an already fragile economy. Food shortages spread, inflation soared, transportation systems buckled under military demand. The state struggled to supply its forces, let alone its civilian population. War accelerated every existing weakness. The fronts multiplied rapidly. In the Caucasus, Ottoman forces faced the Russian Empire in brutal terrain under catastrophic conditions. Poor planning, harsh winters, and inadequate logistics turned campaigns into disasters. Entire units were lost not to enemy fire, but to cold, hunger, and disease. Morale suffered irreparable damage. In the south, British forces advanced through Mesopotamia and Egypt, threatening imperial arteries that had once sustained global trade. The empire fought back fiercely, but each defense consumed men and resources it could not replace. The war became a struggle of attrition the Ottomans were structurally unprepared to win. Internally, coherence frayed. The strains of war magnified long-standing tensions. Ethnic and regional grievances intensified under the pressure of conscription, requisition, and scarcity. Revolts erupted in provinces already weakened by reform and neglect. Loyalty, once anchored in stability, began to dissolve under hunger and loss. Authority itself weakened. The Sultan's position, already symbolic rather than commanding, lost credibility as military defeats mounted. Decision-making fragmented among military leaders, ministers, and factions with competing priorities. Coordination suffered, strategy dissolved into reaction. The empire was no longer steering events. It was being pulled apart by them. Internationally, Ottoman fortunes declined steadily. Allies prioritized their own survival. Promises of post-war security grew vague. Meanwhile, rival powers openly discussed partition. The fate of Ottoman territories became a subject of negotiation long before the war ended. What had once been an empire shaping history was now an object of history. By the war's later years, exhaustion permeated every level of society. Cities faced shortages, soldiers deserted, infrastructure collapsed. The economy, already strained by decades of reform and debt, could no longer sustain prolonged conflict. War had stripped the empire of the one resource it still possessed in abundance: time. The Ottomans did not fall in a single battle. They unraveled across fronts, months, and decisions, each loss narrowing the margin for recovery. Territory slipped away, authority eroded, Legitimacy evaporated. World War I did not create Ottoman decline. It ended it. For the first time in centuries, the empire faced not gradual erosion, but imminent dissolution. Survival was no longer about reform or balance. It was about whether the state itself could exist at all when the guns finally fell silent. And as the war ground on toward its conclusion, one truth became unavoidable. The Ottoman Empire was fighting its last war, not for power, but for existence. As the war dragged into its third and fourth years, the Ottoman Empire ceased to function as a coherent whole. What remained was a patchwork of fronts, each bleeding resources into a central state that could no longer replenish them. Strategy gave way to desperation. Defense replaced initiative. Survival was measured not in victories, but in delays. The human cost was staggering. Conscription swept through villages already weakened by poverty and reform fatigue. Farms were left untended, families fractured. Hunger spread from countryside to city. The state requisitioned food and animals to sustain the army, accelerating civilian suffering. Inflation devoured wages. Trust between ruler and subject, long strained, began to collapse. On the battlefield, fragmentation deepened. In Mesopotamia and Palestine, British forces advanced steadily, supported by superior logistics and control of sea routes. Ottoman defenses, though often courageous, were undermined by shortages and poor coordination. Railways could not deliver supplies consistently. Command structures fractured under pressure. Each retreat exposed new vulnerabilities. The Caucasus Front proved equally devastating. Campaigns fought in mountainous terrain under extreme weather conditions became symbols of miscalculation and human loss. Entire formations disappeared, not through defeat alone, but through exposure and starvation. The empire's inability to protect its own soldiers shattered morale and confidence in leadership. But the most profound rupture occurred from within. In 1916, revolt ignited across parts of the Arab provinces. An uprising fueled by wartime hardship, long-standing grievances, and promises of post-war independence. Known to history as the Arab Revolt, it struck at the empire's southern flank not merely as a military threat, but as a symbolic one. For centuries, the Ottoman system had governed diversity through negotiated loyalty. Now, under the pressure of total war, that balance shattered. The revolt exposed how thin imperial cohesion had become when stability vanished. Provinces once integrated through law and routine now drifted toward alternative futures. European powers exploited this fragmentation ruthlessly. Diplomacy and warfare merged. Promises were made to rebels. Borders were sketched in secret agreements. The fate of Ottoman lands was debated in foreign capitals, while Ottoman soldiers still fought and died to defend them. The empire's sovereignty had been hollowed to the point where its dissolution was planned before it officially occurred. Back in the capital, authority evaporated. Decision-making splintered among military commanders, ministers, and factions. The Sultan, long reduced to symbolic stature, could no longer command loyalty or direction. The state spoke with multiple voices, often contradicting one another. Orders arrived late or not at all. The machinery of governance stalled. By 1918, collapse was no longer theoretical. Allied forces occupied key territories. Communications failed. Armies disintegrated through desertion as much as defeat. Civilians faced famine and disease. The empire's remaining structures existed largely on paper. Ministries without reach, laws without enforcement, authority without belief. When the armistice finally came, it did not feel like peace. It felt like exposure. The war ended not with negotiated equality, but with occupation. Foreign troops entered strategic cities. Railways, ports, and administrative centers fell under external control. The empire's fate was now openly dictated by others. For the Ottoman population, the psychological impact was profound. An empire that had framed identity, order, and legitimacy for centuries was suddenly absent. The old guarantees no longer applied. Law lost authority. Borders lost meaning. Communities looked inward or outward for survival. What remained of the state struggled to assert relevance. Attempts to preserve the Sultanate through diplomacy failed. Credibility had evaporated with defeat. The imperial center, long the axis of power, became a hollow shell, inhabited but no longer commanding. The war had done what reform, stagnation, and external pressure had not. It had broken the empire's coherence. This collapse was not the result of a single betrayal or battlefield failure. It was the cumulative consequence of exhaustion, economic, institutional, and moral, compressed by the unprecedented violence of total war. The Ottomans did not lose because they lacked courage. They lost because the world they had mastered no longer existed, and the world that replaced it demanded capacities they could not generate in time. As the guns fell silent, one truth remained undeniable. The Ottoman Empire had survived centuries of pressure, but it could not survive the 20th century's first war. What followed would not be recovery. It would be reckoning. When the war ended, the Ottoman Empire did not awaken to reconstruction. It awakened to dismantlement. The armistice froze armies in place, but it did not restore authority. Allied forces occupied ports, railways, and administrative centers. Decisions about borders, sovereignty, and governance were now made beyond the empire's reach. What had survived the battlefield could not survive the peace. In the capital, legitimacy evaporated. The Sultanate, already weakened by decades of reform, factionalism, and symbolic rule, stood exposed. The ruler could neither command resistance nor negotiate restoration. Appeals to tradition rang hollow in a world that now measured power by control, not continuity. The empire's legal and moral claims no longer carried weight. Treaties formalized what defeat had made inevitable. Territories that had once defined imperial identity were separated, occupied, or reassigned. Provinces that had been governed for centuries were reimagined as mandates and spheres of influence. Borders were drawn with little regard for imperial memory. The empire's past was not consulted in the construction of its future. Within Anatolia itself, uncertainty turned into confrontation. Occupation provoked resistance. Local leaders rejected the authority of a discredited center and organized around survival and autonomy. What began as regional defiance hardened into a national movement, one that no longer sought to preserve empire, but to replace it. This shift marked the final rupture. For centuries, Ottoman legitimacy had rested on continuity, dynasty, law, and universal authority. Now, legitimacy was being redefined around territory, sovereignty, and popular mobilization. The old framework could not compete. The empire's language no longer described the world its people inhabited. In 1922, the end arrived, not with a final battle, but with a decision. The abolition of the Ottoman Sultanate formally ended the institution that had ruled for more than 6 centuries. The dynasty that began on a frontier had concluded in occupation. Authority was transferred away from a throne that could no longer command belief. The Sultan departed in silence. There was no coronation reversed, no ceremony of closure. Power did not fall. It drained. The state that had once governed continents ceased to exist, not because it was conquered in its heartland, but because it could no longer justify its own continuation. This distinction matters. The Ottoman Empire did not end because it failed to endure. It ended because endurance without sovereignty became meaningless. Its institutions had survived longer than most. Its reforms had delayed collapse. Its resilience had been extraordinary. But in the end, survival alone was not enough to secure legitimacy in a world reordered by total war and national self-determination. What followed was not simple replacement, but transformation. From the empire's remnants emerged a new political project, one that rejected imperial pluralism in favor of territorial nationalism and dynastic continuity in favor of popular sovereignty. The old order was not reformed, it was superseded. Yet the end of the empire did not erase its imprint. Administrative practices endured, legal traditions influenced successors, cities, infrastructure, and social patterns bore the marks of centuries of imperial governance. The empire fell, but it did not vanish. Its legacy persisted in borders drawn, institutions inherited, and identities reshaped. The collapse of the Ottoman Empire was not a sudden catastrophe. It was the final chapter of a long historical arc, one that began in frontier improvisation, matured into imperial order, plateaued through inertia, strained under encounter, and finally fractured under the weight of modern war. In this sense, the end was not betrayal nor failure of courage. It was exhaustion meeting transformation. History often remembers empires for how they rise or how they fall. The Ottoman story demands something more precise, understanding how an empire can last so long that the world changes around it, and how survival itself can become insufficient. The dynasty ended in 1922. But the questions it left behind about governance, diversity, reform, and power did not end with it. They carried forward into the modern age. For from the ruins of empire a new state would rise, and with it a final reckoning with the Ottoman legacy. Empires rarely end with echoes. More often, they end with quiet. When the Ottoman Sultanate was abolished in 1922, there was no thunderous collapse of cities, no burning capitals, no single moment that announced the end of 6 centuries of rule. What followed instead was absence, a sudden quiet where authority once stood, a pause where continuity had long been assumed. The empire that had shaped 3 continents did not explode into ruin. It faded from command. Yet, disappearance is not erasure. From the empire's Anatolian core emerged a new political entity, the Republic of Turkey. It was not a rebranded empire, nor a gradual evolution of Ottoman rule. It was a deliberate rupture, territorial, ideological, and institutional. The imperial framework was rejected in favor of a nation-state built on sovereignty, citizenship, and secular law. At the center of this transformation stood Mustafa Kemal Atatürk, whose project was not restoration, but reinvention. The new republic turned away from dynastic legitimacy and imperial pluralism, embracing a model aligned with 20th century nationalism. The caliphate was abolished. Religious authority separated from the state, law was rewritten, language itself was reformed. On the surface, this appeared to mark a clean break. But history is rarely so tidy. Beneath the rhetoric of rupture, the Ottoman legacy endured, embedded in structures too deep to dismantle overnight. Administrative habits persisted. Legal reasoning echoed imperial precedent even as codes changed. Bureaucratic culture, shaped by centuries of centralized governance, carried forward into republican institutions. The state that replaced the empire was new, but it was not born into a vacuum. Beyond Turkey's borders, the Ottoman imprint was even more visible. The modern Middle East, the Balkans, and parts of North Africa still bear the contours of Ottoman rule. Borders drawn during the empire's dissolution cut across older administrative divisions. Cities once governed from Istanbul retained urban forms shaped by imperial priorities. Legal systems, land tenure practices, and communal relations reflected centuries of Ottoman administration. Even in regions where Ottoman authority ended in conflict, its legacy structured what followed. Languages carried loanwords, cuisines shared techniques and tastes. Music, architecture, and social customs reflected blended histories that imperial borders had once connected. Memory, sometimes nostalgic, sometimes resentful, continued to shape identity. This persistence complicates the narrative of decline. For generations, the Ottoman Empire was portrayed as a sick man, a state weakened by corruption, stagnation, and decay. This image, popularized by rivals and later adopted by historians, reduced a complex reality into a moral judgment. It suggested that the empire fell because it deserved to fall. The historical record tells a different story. The Ottomans were not undone by incompetence or ignorance. They were adaptive for centuries, often more so than their contemporaries. They integrated gunpowder early, built sophisticated legal systems, managed diversity at imperial scale, and reformed repeatedly when pressures mounted. Few states in history survived as long under such varied conditions. Their failure was not moral. It was structural. The empire had been designed to balance difference rather than erase it, to absorb change rather than accelerate it. This design produced remarkable longevity, but it also limited speed. When the global system began to reward rapid industrialization, aggressive standardization, and total mobilization, the Ottoman framework struggled to keep pace. Reform came, but late. Modernization arrived, but cautiously. The empire survived challenge after challenge, but each survival consumed reserves of time, autonomy, and flexibility. By the 20th century, endurance itself had become the achievement. When total war arrived, it demanded capacities the empire could no longer generate quickly enough. Collapse, then, was not sudden failure. It was the end of a long negotiation between structure and change. Understanding this matters, not to romanticize the past, but to learn from it. The Ottoman experience challenges simplistic assumptions about power. It shows that resilience can delay collapse without preventing it, that inclusion can stabilize empires without guaranteeing renewal, and that longevity is not the same as adaptability. The empire did not fall because it was weak. It fell because the world outpaced it. And yet, in its passing, it left behind more than ruins. It left behind lessons about governance, diversity, reform, and the limits of balance in an accelerating world. These lessons did not end in 1922. They continue to shape politics, identities, and debates across regions once held together by imperial law and routine. The Ottomans are gone. But the world they shaped is not. Legacy is not what an empire intends to leave behind. It is what remains when intention is gone. Across the territories once governed from Istanbul, the Ottoman imprint did not survive as a unified memory. It fragmented, absorbed into local histories, reshaped by new states, reframed by new ideologies. In some places, the empire is remembered as a stabilizing order. In others, as a constraint to be overcome. Both memories are true. Empires do not leave singular legacies. They leave layered ones. In governance, the Ottoman inheritance proved especially durable. Administrative practices, record-keeping, land registration, judicial hierarchy continued to inform post-imperial states. Even where legal codes were replaced wholesale, the habits of administration endured. How authority communicates, how disputes are processed, how the center relates to the periphery. These patterns, refined over centuries, outlived the empire that produced them. In the Balkans, the Middle East, and North Africa, modern state institutions often grew within Ottoman administrative shells. Ministries replaced imperial offices, but inherited their structures. Capital cities expanded along routes once defined by imperial logistics. Tax systems adapted older frameworks. The past did not dictate outcomes. but it shaped the terrain on which new states built. Culturally, the Ottoman legacy is everywhere and nowhere. Languages retain shared vocabularies formed through centuries of coexistence. Foodways overlap across borders drawn long after imperial kitchens had standardized tastes. Music carries echoes of courtly and popular traditions that traveled with merchants, soldiers, and scholars. Architecture, domes, courtyards, public complexes continues to organize urban life in cities far from Istanbul. These continuities are often invisible to those living among them. They are not monuments, but habits, ways of building, eating, speaking, and gathering that persist without attribution. The empire dissolved, but the patterns of life it connected did not dissolve with it. Memory, however, remains contested. In the successor states, national narratives often define themselves in opposition to empire. Independence required distance. Identity required differentiation. Ottoman rule was recast as obstacle rather than framework. This was not historical falsification, it was political necessity. New nations needed origins that affirmed sovereignty, not subordination. Yet over time this clarity blurred. As generations passed, the empire receded from lived experience into history. What remained was not domination, but context. Scholars began reassessing the Ottoman past, not as a story of inevitable decline, but as a case study in imperial management at scale. Complexity replaced caricature. This reassessment altered how the empire is understood. The Ottomans were not simply a Muslim power ruling non-Muslims. They were administrators of diversity who governed through negotiated loyalty. They were not hostile to reform by nature. They reformed repeatedly, often earlier than their rivals. They were not ignorant of modernity, they encountered it on unfavorable terms. Their longevity forces comparison. Few empires managed to integrate so many peoples, languages, and faiths for so long without constant rebellion. Few balanced central authority with local autonomy so effectively. Few adapted across as many technological and political eras without catastrophic rupture. These achievements do not excuse failure, but they complicate it. The empire's end invites a more precise question, not why it fell, but why it lasted. The answer lies in structure. Ottoman governance prioritized balance over acceleration. It absorbed change rather than amplifying it. This approach produced stability across centuries, but it limited responsiveness when the global system began rewarding speed, standardization, and industrial capacity. The empire did not collapse from decay. It was outpaced by transformation. This distinction matters beyond Ottoman history. It challenges linear narratives of progress and decline. It reminds us that systems optimized for one era may struggle in another, not because they are flawed, but because conditions have changed. It warns against mistaking endurance for adaptability and stability for sustainability. In the modern world, states still face versions of this dilemma. How much continuity can a system preserve without losing relevance? How much reform can it absorb without fracturing identity? The Ottoman experience does not offer easy answers, but it offers perspective. Empires do not fall solely from weakness. They fall when the balance between structure and change breaks and cannot be restored in time. The Ottomans came closer than most to maintaining that balance across centuries. Their final failure does not erase that achievement. It contextualizes it. What endures, then, is not the empire itself, but the questions it leaves behind, about governance, pluralism, reform, and the cost of survival in a world that accelerates relentlessly. The Ottoman Empire is gone. But the problems it wrestled with are not. When the Ottoman Empire ended, it did not leave behind a single conclusion. It left behind a question, one that history continues to ask in different forms, across different societies, under different names. How does power endure without becoming rigid? For more than 6 centuries, the Ottomans governed not through uniformity, but through accommodation. They ruled an empire of differences by refusing to collapse them into one identity. Faiths coexisted under law. Cultures retained autonomy within order. Authority flowed from the center, but life remained local. This architecture did not produce constant glory, but it produced remarkable longevity. That longevity is the empire's greatest achievement and its greatest vulnerability. The Ottoman system was designed to last, not to race. It absorbed shocks rather than accelerating change. It prioritized stability over reinvention. For centuries, this strategy worked. It allowed the empire to outlive rivals, adapt to gunpowder, manage diversity, and reform without revolution. Few political systems in history matched this resilience. But the modern world did not reward resilience alone. The 19th and 20th centuries introduced a new logic of power, one defined by speed, industrial capacity, mass mobilization, and ideological uniformity. States that could reorganize rapidly gained advantage. Those that could not fell behind, regardless of their past strength. The Ottomans encountered this shift not as observers, but as participants forced to adapt midstream. They adapted, but incrementally. Reform came, but cautiously. Modern institutions emerged, but alongside older ones. Equality was proclaimed, but layered atop communal difference. Sovereignty was defended, but compromised through dependency. The empire changed, but it could not change faster than the world around it. This is the core lesson of the Ottoman legacy. Empires do not fail simply because they are corrupt or immoral. They fail when the structures that once ensured success become constraints under new conditions. The Ottomans were not defeated by ignorance. They were defeated by timing. Modernization arrived after centuries of balance had hardened into habit. Their collapse was not inevitable, but it was structural. This understanding challenges simplistic narratives of decline. It reframes the Ottoman story not as tragedy alone, but as caution. It shows how systems optimized for inclusion and endurance may struggle in eras that demand acceleration and standardization. It reminds us that reform delayed is not the same as reform denied, but delay has consequences. Yet the empire's legacy is not confined to failure. It endures in the political geography of the modern world. Borders drawn from its dissolution still define states and conflicts. Administrative habits shape governance. Cultural continuities bind regions once united by imperial routine. Even debates about pluralism, reform, and sovereignty echo Ottoman dilemmas. In Turkey itself, the republic that replaced the empire defined itself through rupture, but could not fully escape inheritance. Centralized governance, state-led reform, and suspicion of fragmentation all reflect lessons learned from imperial collapse. The past was rejected, but it was also studied, absorbed, and transformed. This duality, rejection and inheritance, mirrors the empire's own history. The Ottomans rose by adapting to the ruins of older powers. They ruled by balancing tradition and innovation. They fell when that balance could no longer be maintained. In this sense, their story is not exceptional. It is instructive. History does not judge empires by how long they rule alone. It judges them by what they reveal about power itself. The Ottoman Empire reveals that longevity is not proof of permanence, that stability can delay collapse without preventing it, and that survival, while admirable, is not the same as renewal. It shows that governance of diversity can sustain empires, but requires constant reinvention to endure changing worlds. Above all, it reminds us that decline is rarely dramatic until it is complete. For centuries, the Ottomans endured, absorbing loss, negotiating reform, adapting just enough to survive. When the end came, it did not arrive as sudden catastrophe. It arrived as conclusion. 600 years of rule ended not in fire, but in silence. And from that silence emerged a world still shaped by what had been. its borders, its institutions, its memories, and its unresolved questions. The Ottoman Empire is no longer a living power, but its story remains one of the most important case studies in human governance, of how empires rise, how they endure, and why even the most resilient systems must evolve faster than history itself. For the Ottoman legacy is not a relic of the past, it is a mirror held up to every power that believed survival alone is enough.